She would learn his secrets. She would hear him scream a dead man's name in the dark, his voice raw with a grief she couldn't understand. She would discover that he'd been searching for her face for 18 years, long before she knew he existed, long before her father's debt had dropped her at his feet like an offering. But Amelia Chapman didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was the weight of the dress crushing her ribs, the scent of white roses thick enough to choke on, and the man waiting at the altar, a man who hadn't smiled once in the 3 days since he'd bought her. Roel Rucci, 39 years old, third-generation Chicago, with roots in the Albanian mountains that his family had never forgotten. The kind of name mothers whispered to frighten children into obedience. The kind of name that made prosecutors retire early and witnesses forget what they'd seen. The chapel doors opened. 50 faces turned, pale blurs in the candlelight. Strangers who'd come to watch her sign her life away. And Amelia walked toward a future that would either save her or destroy her. The organ swelled, mournful and ancient, filling the chapel with a sound that vibrated through her bones and settled deep in her chest. Her feet moved without permission, carrying her down an aisle that seemed to stretch into eternity. And with each step, the memories came flooding back, unwanted, unstoppable, dragging her under. The hospital room, her mother's hand in hers, bones wrapped in paper-thin skin, the rattle of breath that came slower each day. The doctor's voice explaining that the experimental treatment could work, could buy them years instead of months, if only they had $200,000 they would never have. The parking lot. 2 men in dark suits who knew her name before she spoke it, who told her that her father had vanished with $300,000 that didn't belong to him, who made it clear that debts didn't disappear just because debtors did. Thomas. The name burned in her chest like acid. The man who'd raised her, who'd sat at their dinner table for 15 years pretending to be a father, had stolen from monsters and run, leaving her and her dying mother to pay the price. No note, no warning, no apology. Just an empty closet where his clothes used to be, and a debt that would swallow her whole. She hoped he was rotting somewhere. She hoped he never slept again. And then the room. That vast, cold room that smelled of leather and power and old money that had been washed clean of the blood it was built on. They'd brought her there blindfolded 3 days ago. She remembered the scratch of expensive carpet beneath her bare feet, the sound of heavy doors closing behind her, the moment the cloth had been pulled from her eyes and she'd found herself standing in a study that cost more than her mother's entire house. Her eyes had gone straight to the floor. She couldn't help it, couldn't force herself to look up at the man who'd summoned her like a package to be inspected. The carpet was Persian, she remembered thinking, deep burgundy and gold, probably older than her grandmother. She'd counted the threads while she waited for someone to speak. Miss Chapman, a voice from behind her. Not his voice, she would learn later. One of his men, Besnik, the one with the weathered face and the eyes that saw everything. Mr. Rucci will see you now. She'd lifted her gaze then, expecting to meet the eyes of the man who held her mother's life in his hands. Instead, she found herself staring at a back. Broad shoulders wrapped in charcoal wool, a silhouette dark against the Chicago skyline, A man who couldn't be bothered to turn around for the woman he was about to buy. Her hands had trembled at her sides. Her throat had closed around words she didn't know how to speak. She remembered opening her mouth, closing it, opening it again, a fish drowning in air that was too rich, too cold, too full of power she didn't understand. "You're smaller than I expected." His voice came without warning, flat and utterly disinterested, and she flinched at the sound of it. He still hadn't turned, still stood at that window, like she was beneath his notice, like this meeting was an inconvenience he was suffering through, rather than a transaction he'd initiated. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, forced herself to try again. "I'm sorry about the money. My stepfather, I didn't know he was—" "I don't care about the money." The words cut through her stammering, sharp and final. She watched his shoulders shift, watched his head tilt almost imperceptibly to the side. "I want a wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Amelia felt her breath catch somewhere behind her ribs, felt her heart slam against her chest so hard she was sure he could hear it across the room. What? A wife. He said it the same way someone might say a coffee or a newspaper, something to be acquired, something to be owned. "You'll do." Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into palms that had gone slick with sweat. She should run, should scream, should do anything except stand here like a lamb waiting for slaughter. "Why?" The word came out barely a whisper. "Why me?" "Why? My reasons are my own." His reflection in the glass was too faint to read, just a smudge of darkness against the glittering city, a shadow that could have been anyone or anything. She stared at it, searching for something human, something she could understand, and found nothing but the rigid line of his spine and the careful stillness of a man who had learned to give nothing away. "Marry me, and your mother's treatment is paid for. Every bill, every experimental procedure. The best doctors in the country." He paused, and she saw his hand move, lifting a glass, bringing it to lips she couldn't see. "Refuse, and I collect on your stepfather's debt the traditional way." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. She knew what traditional meant in his world, had heard enough whispers, seen enough headlines, understood enough to know that the money Thomas had stolen wasn't the kind of debt that came with a payment plan. "You have 24 hours to decide." She'd said yes in 12. He still hadn't turned around. And now, here she was, 10 feet from the altar, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, about to marry a man who hadn't bothered to look at her face. The aisle ended. The organ fell silent, and the man before her finally began to turn. Roel Rucci had buried his capacity for surprise somewhere between his 19th birthday and his 26th, packed it away in the same unmarked grave where he'd left mercy and hesitation and all the other weaknesses that got men in his position killed. He turned to face his bride with clinical detachment, expecting nothing more than a formality, the face behind the contract he'd signed without bothering to examine. His hand reached for the veil, fingers closing around the delicate fabric. The gauze was soft against his skin, expensive and utterly meaningless, and he lifted it with a single fluid motion. The fabric fell away, and for the first time, Roel Rucci looked at the woman he'd married. Green eyes met his. The world stopped. Two men in dark suits who knew her name before she spoke it, who told her that her father had vanished with $300,000 that didn't belong to him, who made it clear that debts didn't disappear just because debtors did. Thomas. The name burned in her chest like acid. The man who'd raised her, who'd sat at their dinner table for 15 years pretending to be a father, had stolen from monsters and run, leaving her and her dying mother to pay the price. No note, no warning, no apology. Just an empty closet where his clothes used to be, and a debt that would swallow her whole. She hoped he was rotting somewhere. She hoped he never slept again. He'd watched the light fade from them 18 years ago in a warehouse that smelled of blood and gunpowder, had stood frozen as the man who'd raised him more than his own father ever had took a bullet meant for traitors. "My daughter." Nick's voice echoed through the years, wet with blood, fading with each word. "Protect my little girl." His shoulders went rigid beneath the weight of his suit. His hands, those hands that had never trembled while pulling a trigger, while signing death warrants, while burying men who'd crossed him, began to shake. She was staring at him, this girl with Nick's eyes, confusion flickering across features that were too familiar, too impossible. Her brow furrowed slightly, her teeth pressing into her lower lip, and the gesture made something crack behind his ribs. She didn't know, had no idea who she was, what her face meant to the man standing frozen before her. 18 years of searching. 18 years of dead ends and cold trails, and now she was here, in a wedding dress, about to become his wife. "Royal?" Besnick's voice came from behind him, low and urgent. His oldest friend, the only man who'd been there that night, who'd watched him fail. "Boss, the priest is waiting." The words cut through the fog. Roel blinked, felt the mask slide back into place through sheer force of will. His hands steadied, his breathing evened. And he looked at Nick's daughter with eyes that revealed nothing. "Continue." His voice came out flat and controlled, and he watched the priest stumble through vows that meant nothing in this chapel full of killers. He'd found her. After 18 years, he'd finally found her. And he had no idea what he was supposed to do now. The kiss was nothing, a brush of his lips against the corner of her mouth, there and gone before she could react. But his hand on her jaw was something else entirely. His fingers cradled her face with a gentleness that made no sense, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone like she was something precious, something fragile, something he was afraid to break. She felt the calluses on his palm, rough against her skin, felt the barely there tremor in his touch, felt the heat of him so close, sandalwood and whiskey filling her lungs until she couldn't breathe. And confusion crashed through her in waves. He'd frozen when he saw her face. She'd watched it happen, watched the color drain from his skin, watched his hands begin to shake, watched something crack open behind those dark eyes before the mask slammed back into place. In that moment, he hadn't looked like a monster. He'd looked like a man who'd just seen something impossible. Why? The question burned in her throat as he pulled away, as the chapel erupted in polite applause, as the priest announced them husband and wife. She could still feel the ghost of his touch on her jaw, could still smell him on her skin, and her mind raced to understand what she'd witnessed. "What did you see when you looked at me?" The reception passed in fragments. Faces she wouldn't remember, names that slid through her mind like water, congratulations that sounded more like condolences. She smiled when she was supposed to smile, nodded when she was supposed to nod, and tried to make sense of the man she'd married. He moved through the crowd like a shark through still water, speaking to men who flinched at his approach, accepting congratulations with a coldness that made the air feel thin. The most dangerous man in Chicago, they called him. She'd heard the whispers. The best doctors in the country. He paused, and she saw his hand move, lifting a glass, bringing it to lips she couldn't see. "Refuse, and I collect on your stepfather's debt the traditional way." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. She knew what traditional meant in his world, had heard enough whispers, seen enough headlines, understood enough to know that the money Thomas had stolen wasn't the kind of debt that came with a payment plan. "You have 24 hours to decide." She'd said yes in 12. He still hadn't turned around. And now, here she was, 10 feet from the altar, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, about to marry a man who hadn't bothered to look at her face. The name landed like a blow, and Amelia followed in silence, her heart climbing into her throat with every step. The bedroom was enormous, cream walls stretching toward an impossibly high ceiling, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city like the eyes of a god watching its creation burn, and in the center of it all, a bed draped in white sheets that seemed to glow in the dim light, white like a surrender, white like a sacrifice. The room smelled of cedar and something floral, lilies maybe, or roses left too long in still water. Amelia stood in the center of it, her arms wrapped around herself, her bare feet cold against the marble floor, and tried to remember how to breathe. Mrs. Hannah had laid out a nightgown, white silk, modest, covering her from collarbone to ankle, and left with a whispered, "Try to rest," that fooled neither of them. Amelia changed in the bathroom, her fingers clumsy on the buttons, her reflection pale and hollow-eyed in the mirror. The silk was cool against her skin, soft in a way that felt like mockery, and she was still staring at herself when she heard the bedroom door open. Her heart stopped. Footsteps crossed the carpet, measured, unhurried, and she pressed herself against the bathroom counter, her fingers gripping the marble until her knuckles went white. "Come out, Amelia." His voice came through the door, low and stripped of ice. She heard him move, heard the soft clink of glass, and forced herself to breathe. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Her legs felt like water as she stepped into the bedroom. And the sight of him stole whatever air she had left. He stood by the window with his back to her, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He'd removed his jacket and tie, rolled his sleeves up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and mapped with scars. Even in this posture of supposed rest, he radiated danger, a predator at ease, a blade not yet drawn. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words fell into the silence, and Amelia felt her breath catch somewhere behind her ribs. He still wasn't looking at her, still holding himself apart, untouchable, unknowable. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to run. She wanted to understand why he'd looked at her like she'd risen from a grave. Her voice cracked, splintering on the confession. She swallowed hard, her throat working around words that didn't want to come, her hands twisting in the silk of her nightgown. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the sharp line of his jaw, the scar that traced along it like a secret. "I know." The two words landed soft and certain, and something in his voice made her chest ache. He set his whiskey down on the windowsill, the glass meeting marble without a sound, and finally turned to face her. His eyes were dark, darker than she remembered, and deep within them, something was burning that she couldn't name. "Do you know what Besa means?" The question came from nowhere, shattering the silence like a stone through glass. Amelia blinked at him, her mind struggling to shift gears, and shook her head mutely. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, her skin too tight, her thoughts tangled in knots she couldn't begin to unravel. "It's an Albanian oath." He moved toward her, each step deliberate, controlled, and she forced herself not to retreat. A promise that binds a man's honor to his word until death. My family has kept Besa for 3 generations in this country, longer in the old one. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough for her to smell sandalwood and whiskey, close enough to see the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face like scars that had never healed. His eyes held hers, dark and fathomless, and she saw something there that made her chest ache, something old and wounded that he was trying desperately to hide. "We don't break our promises, we don't abandon our debts, and we don't—" His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin, the words catching on something jagged and raw. "We don't take what isn't freely given." Amelia stared at him, her mind racing to find meaning beneath the words, and watched him cross to the dresser against the far wall. He opened the top drawer and withdrew a small leather case, his movements precise and unhesitating. The knife inside gleamed in the low light, short-bladed, wickedly sharp. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She stumbled back a step before she could stop herself, her hands flying up in instinctive defense. He saw the movement and paused, something flickering across his face that looked almost like pain. "Not for you." His voice was quiet, certain, and she watched in frozen silence as he drew the blade across his own palm without flinching. Blood welled dark and vivid against his skin, pooling in the lines of his palm before spilling over. He crossed to the bed without hesitation and pressed his hand to the white sheets, his fingers spreading to leave a perfect crimson bloom that spread like a flower opening at dawn. "The best doctors in the country." He paused, and she saw his hand move, lifting a glass, bringing it to lips she couldn't see. "Refuse, and I collect on your stepfather's debt the traditional way." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. She knew what traditional meant in his world, had heard enough whispers, seen enough headlines, understood enough to know that the money Thomas had stolen wasn't the kind of debt that came with a payment plan. "You have 24 hours to decide." She'd said yes in 12. He still hadn't turned around. And now, here she was, 10 feet from the altar, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, about to marry a man who hadn't bothered to look at her face. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something old and wounded. Because some things, once taken, can never be returned. He moved toward the door, and she realized he was leaving, not expecting her to share the bed, not demanding anything at all. "I won't touch you until you ask me to." His hand closed around the doorknob, the metal catching the dim light, and he paused without turning around. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, and something about the way he held himself made her think of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, frozen between jumping and walking away. "And even then, I'll make you ask twice." "To be sure." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Then the door was opening, and his silhouette filled the frame for a moment, dark against the light, impossibly alone. "Get some sleep, Amelia." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft finality that echoed through the empty room. Amelia stood frozen where he'd left her, her eyes fixed on the bloodstain spreading across the white sheets, her mind struggling to make sense of the impossible. A monster who cut himself rather than cut her down. A stranger who looked at her like she was a wound he'd been carrying for years. A husband who gave her his blood instead of taking hers. "Who are you, Roel Rucci?" She crossed to the bed on legs that felt like water and sat on the edge, her fingers hovering over the crimson bloom without quite touching it. The blood was still wet, still warm, and she could smell the copper of it mixing with the cedar and the roses. "What do you see when you look at me?" The questions hung in the darkness, unanswered. The city glittered far below like a scattered handful of stars. And somewhere in this gilded cage, the man who had married her was carrying a weight she couldn't see. But she was starting to feel it. And despite everything, despite the fear and the confusion and the bars she could sense closing around her, some small, treacherous part of her wanted to understand. Amelia woke to the smell of blood, the rust-colored stain on white sheets, dragging her back from dreams she couldn't remember into a reality she couldn't escape. For a long moment, she simply lay there, staring at the evidence of last night's strange mercy, trying to reconcile the violence of that cut with the gentleness that had followed. He'd done that for her, sliced his own palm open without flinching, pressed his bleeding hand to the sheets, and walked away like it cost him nothing at all. Why? The question had no answer, only the faint copper smell that still lingered in the air and the sound of the door opening behind her. Mrs. Hanna moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades navigating spaces that didn't belong to her, fresh linens folded in her arms. Her dark eyes swept across the bed, landed on the stain, and something flickered there. Not judgment, not pity, but something that looked almost like respect. She bundled the sheets without a word, her weathered hands gentle against the ruined fabric, and Amelia felt her throat tighten at the care in that gesture. "Breakfast is in the east dining room." Mrs. Hanna's voice was neutral, carefully blank. "Mr. Rucci is waiting." He sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 20, a newspaper spread before him, and a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. The morning light caught the sharp planes of his face, the scar along his jaw, and Amelia hesitated in the doorway, with her heart beating too fast and her hands clasped too tight. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her existence as she chose a chair halfway down the table. as a servant placed food before her that she couldn't imagine eating, as the silence stretched between them like a held breath. "Your mother's treatment began this morning." His voice cut through the quiet without warning, and Amelia's fingers froze around her fork. He still wasn't looking at her, his eyes fixed on the newspaper, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed, a tension that hadn't been there before, a careful stillness that suggested he was paying far more attention than he appeared. "Dr. Yusuf is the best oncologist in the state." He turned a page with precise, controlled movements. "She'll receive everything she needs." The fork trembled in Amelia's grip, and she set it down carefully before she could drop it or throw it at his head. "Thank you." The words came out smaller than she intended, and she watched his jaw tighten at the sound of them, a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but real. "Don't thank me." He still wouldn't look at her, still held himself apart, untouchable, as if the man who had whispered against her lips last night had never existed. "This is a transaction. You held up your end, I'm holding up mine." A transaction. The words settled into her chest like a stone, cold and heavy. Of course that's all this was. The bloody sheets, the gentle words, the way he'd touched her face like she was something precious. None of it had been kindness. Just another form of control, another way of keeping her off balance in a game she didn't understand. She pushed back from the table and left without another word, and Roel let her go. His eyes stayed fixed on the newspaper, but the words had long since stopped making sense. Besnik appeared in the doorway she'd just vacated, his weathered face troubled in a way that made Roel's shoulders tighten. "The Columbos." Besnik's voice was low, meant for Roel's ears alone. "They've been quiet, too quiet." Roel turned a page he hadn't read, his jaw hardening beneath the mask of indifference. "Marco's been asking questions about you, about your new wife." The newspaper crumpled slightly in Roel's grip before he forced his fingers to relax. Marco Colombo. The brother of the man Roel had killed 15 years ago. The wound that had never healed. The vendetta that waited in the shadows like a patient snake. "Let him ask." Roel's voice came out flat, controlled. "If he moves, we'll know." Besnik hesitated in the doorway, something unspoken flickering across his features. "And if he moves against her?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Roel folded the newspaper with precise, deliberate movements and rose from the table, his eyes finally lifting to meet Besnik's. "Then I'll finish what I started 15 years ago." She found trouble in the corridor outside the dining room, though trouble found her first. The man who stepped from the alcove was old. 60 at least, maybe older, but age had done nothing to soften him. Silver hair swept back from a face carved from contempt, cold eyes tracking her approach with the clinical assessment of a butcher evaluating livestock. The ring on his right hand caught the light, identical to the one Roel wore, and when he smiled, it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "The American wife." His voice was deep and cold, accented in ways that Roel's wasn't, and Amelia felt the hair rise on the back of her neck as he stepped into her path. Soft. The word came out like a verdict, like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. "My nephew could have had anyone, daughters of old families. Women who understand our ways, our blood, our traditions. Instead, he chooses this, a girl with nothing, a girl who doesn't belong here." He leaned closer, close enough for her to smell tobacco and malice, and something cold slithered down her spine. "Enjoy your time in this house, Mrs. Rucci, however long it lasts." He paused, turning back with a smile that made her blood run cold. "My nephew thinks he can protect you, but Roel won't live forever, and when he's gone, His eyes traveled down her body with a contempt that made her skin crawl. "I'll make sure this family gets a proper wife. One way or another." He moved past her without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a countdown. And Amelia stood frozen in his wake, with her pulse pounding and her hands shaking at her sides. "You don't belong here." The words echoed through her mind, cruel and true, and she hated how much they hurt. But beneath the hurt, something else was stirring. A cold, clear understanding that Darden wasn't just threatening her. He was making a promise, and promises, in this world, had a way of being kept. On the fourth night, she tried to run. The garden wall loomed silver in the moonlight, thick with climbing roses that bit into her palms as she climbed. She was halfway up when his voice stopped her cold, rolling out of the darkness like thunder from a clear sky. "Where would you go?" Her fingers tightened on the trellis until the thorns drew blood, but she didn't turn around, couldn't. If she turned around, she would see him, and if she saw him, she would remember who she was. A bought bride, a paid debt, a girl with nothing who had traded her freedom for her mother's life. "Your mother is in my hospital." His footsteps crunched on the gravel, slow and unhurried, drawing closer with each word. "Your father is alive because I allow it. You have no money, no identification, no one who would hide you from me." Your father. The words twisted in her gut like a knife. Thomas wasn't her father. He was the coward who'd sold her to monsters and vanished into the night. He was probably sipping cocktails on some beach right now, free and clear, while she climbed walls with bleeding hands and a ring she never wanted burning on her finger. She hoped Roel found him. She hoped he made it hurt. He was right behind her now, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through her thin shirt, close enough that his breath stirred the hair at the nape of her neck. "So I'll ask again, Amelia." His hand closed around her wrist, not hard, not painful, but immovable. "Where exactly did you think you were going?" He pulled her down from the trellis with the same effortless control he brought to everything, and suddenly they were standing face to face in the moonlit garden with barely inches between them. His eyes were black in the darkness, unreadable, and the scar on his jaw gleamed like silver thread. "Anywhere." The word came out broken, more sob than speech. "Anywhere but here." His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, not releasing, just softening, and something flickered across his face that she couldn't name. "You can't run from me." His voice had dropped, low and rough. "I own this city. Every cop, every judge, every rat in every alley. There is nowhere you could go that I wouldn't find you." The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, but somewhere beneath it, something else was stirring. Anger, maybe, or defiance, or just the stubborn refusal to be owned. "Then why haven't you destroyed me?" The words escaped before she could stop them, reckless and raw, and she felt the change in him immediately, a stillness that spread through his body like ice forming over water. "You've made it clear you can." She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "So why haven't you? Why the hospital? Why the bloody sheets? Why any of it, if I'm just a transaction?" The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. His thumb rested against her pulse point, and she wondered if he could feel how fast her heart was racing. "Don't try this again." His voice had gone hard, the brief flash of something human retreating behind the mask. "Next time, it won't be me who finds you. It will be my uncle." He released her wrist and stepped back, and the sudden absence of his warmth made her shiver. She watched him disappear into the darkness and stayed standing among the roses until her legs stopped shaking. The cage was complete. She understood that now. But a question was taking shape in her mind, one that had nothing to do with escape. What debt are you paying, Roel Rucci, and why does it feel like it has something to do with me? She asked to see her mother the next morning. To her surprise, he said yes. No conditions, no guards following her into the room. Just a driver who waited in the parking lot, and a promise to return before dark. The hospital room smelled of flowers and antiseptic, and Margaret looked stronger than she had in months, her grip firm, her eyes clear, her voice steady as she reached for her daughter's hand. "You're wearing a ring." Amelia's fingers twitched, her thumb moving instinctively to cover the platinum band. Heat flooded her cheeks, spreading down her neck, and she found herself staring at the flowers on the windowsill because she couldn't bear to meet her mother's eyes. Her throat worked around words that didn't want to come, and when she finally spoke, her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "I got married, Mom." Margaret's hand tightened around hers, almost painfully, and something shifted in her face. Confusion giving way to fear. Fear giving way to something that looked almost like recognition. "Oh, Amelia, what did you do?" "What I had to." The words came out harder than she intended. "For you, to save you." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them could say. Then Margaret's lips parted, and her voice came out barely a whisper. "Just like your—" She stopped, swallowed. Her eyes darted away. "Like my what?" Amelia leaned forward, her heart suddenly pounding. "Mom, like my what?" But Margaret had already closed her eyes, her face settling into the false peace of someone pretending to sleep, and Amelia was left holding her hand in a room full of flowers with questions no one would answer. Amelia found Roel in the library past midnight, sitting by the cold fireplace with a book he wasn't reading. The lamp beside him cast his face in sharp relief, the exhaustion beneath the mask, the shadows pooled in the hollows of his cheeks, and Amelia hesitated in the doorway with her fingers curled around the frame. She should leave, should retreat to her room and her questions and the safety of distance. But something about the way he sat there, so still, so alone, held her in place. Her fingers tightened on the doorframe, knuckles going white, and she felt the words rise in her throat before she could stop them. "I couldn't sleep." Her voice came out thin, fragile in the vastness of the room. He didn't startle, didn't even look up, just turned a page of the book he wasn't reading, his fingers moving with that same deliberate precision that characterized everything he did. Neither could I. The admission surprised her, not the words themselves, but the weariness beneath them. She stepped inside and chose a chair across from his, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, far enough to run if she needed to. The leather creaked softly as she settled into it, and she folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. The foundation. She watched his fingers tighten on the book, watched the tendons in his hands go taut beneath the skin. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but he didn't look up. The Rucci Family Cancer Foundation. You created it. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. His jaw clenched, released, clenched again, and she could see him waging some invisible war behind those dark eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully flat. "It serves a purpose." A purpose. The non-answer landed between them like a stone. Amelia's pulse quickened, her nails pressing crescents into her palms as she leaned forward in her chair. "What debt are you paying, Roel?" His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way nothing else about their marriage had been. She saw him react, a tiny flinch, barely perceptible, as if she'd touched a wound he'd thought was hidden. Something flickered behind his eyes, old pain, buried deep, but not deep enough. His gaze dropped to his hands, to the scar on his palm that was still healing, and she watched him trace the raised line of it with his thumb. When he spoke, His voice came out rougher than before, scraped raw by something she couldn't see. Some debts aren't measured in money. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning she couldn't grasp. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs, and she leaned forward despite herself, her heart hammering against her chest. Then what kind of debt? Enough. The word cut through her, quiet and absolute. He closed the book with a soft thud and finally looked at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. Not anger, something older. Something that looked almost like grief, like a wound that had never healed properly and probably never would. You ask a lot of questions. His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful, and Amelia felt her spine straighten despite the hammering of her heart. Her chin lifted, defiance rising through the fear like a blade through water. Her hands uncurled from their fists, pressing flat against her thighs to steady herself. You don't answer any of them. Something shifted in his expression, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. Not quite a smile, but closer than she'd ever seen. For a moment, he looked almost human beneath the mask, and something in her chest ached at the glimpse of the man he might have been before the world had carved him into this. No, I don't. He rose and moved toward the door, his footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. She turned to watch him go, her throat tight with words she didn't know how to speak. The question burned inside her, demanding to be asked again, but she already knew he wouldn't answer. Not tonight, maybe not ever. But something else was rising in its place, an instinct, a truth she felt more than understood. Roel. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe, his back to her, and she watched his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed to cost him everything. The lamplight caught the rigid line of his spine, the tension coiled in every muscle, and she wondered how long he'd been carrying whatever weight was crushing him. Whoever you lost. She didn't know where the words came from, only that they felt true. Her voice softened, the defiance bleeding into something gentler. I'm sorry. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She saw his hand tighten on the doorframe until his knuckles went white, saw the tension ripple through his body like a wave crashing against stone. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe, and she thought he might simply walk away without a word. Then his head bowed, just slightly, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. So am I. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft finality that echoed through the empty room. Amelia sat frozen in the lamplight, her heart pounding, her mind racing through everything he'd said and everything he hadn't. Some debts aren't measured in money. So am I. Sorry for what? For buying her? For whatever had put that grief in his eyes? For being the kind of man who built cancer foundations and bled onto wedding sheets and still couldn't answer a simple question? She didn't understand him, couldn't reconcile the man who'd threatened her mother's life with the one who'd cut his own palm to protect her honor. Couldn't make sense of someone who looked at her like she mattered and then walked away like she didn't exist. Was he cruel or kind? Did he see her as property or as a person? Was any of this real or just another game she didn't know the rules to? She had no answers, only questions that multiplied every time he opened his mouth. But one thing was becoming harder to ignore. The man who'd bought her wasn't the monster she'd expected, and that terrified her more than the monster ever could. The file sat open on Roel's desk, its contents spread across the mahogany like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Margaret Chapman, formerly Margaret Miller, married Thomas Chapman in 2010. One daughter, Amelia, listed as her biological child from a previous relationship. Father deceased. He stared at the photograph clipped to the corner of the page, a grainy image pulled from a driver's license database. Margaret Chapman looked like any other middle-aged woman, tired eyes, graying hair, the kind of face that disappeared into crowds. Nothing remarkable, nothing memorable, nothing that should have made his chest tighten like a fist was closing around his heart. But there were gaps in her history, holes that didn't make sense. Before 2008, Margaret Miller didn't exist. No tax records, no employment history, no trace of the life she must have lived before appearing in Chicago with a 4-year-old daughter and a past she'd clearly invented. Who were you before you became Margaret Miller? Roelle pulled another photograph from the stack, this one of Amelia, taken from her university records. She smiled at the camera with those impossible green eyes, and the breath caught in his throat the same way it had at the altar. "Protect my little girl," Nick's voice echoed through 18 years of silence, and Roelle pressed his palm flat against the desk to steady himself. The wound he'd carved into his flesh on their wedding night had scabbed over, but it still ached when he moved wrong, a reminder of promises made and broken, of debts that could never be repaid. He'd searched for Nick's family for 18 years, hired investigators, bribed officials, called in favors from men who owed him their lives, and nothing. Mira Marqueux and her daughter had vanished like smoke, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment and a grave that Roelle still visited on the anniversary of the execution. Now here was this girl with Nick's eyes, married to him by accident or fate or some cosmic joke he didn't understand. And he couldn't shake the feeling that the universe was either giving him a chance at redemption or setting him up for the cruelest punishment imaginable. Margaret Miller. Before 2008, she didn't exist. Mira Marqueux disappeared in 2007. The math was too simple, too obvious. And yet he couldn't be certain, not without proof, not without something more than green eyes and convenient timing, and the desperate hope of a man drowning in his own guilt. He needed more information. He needed to be sure. Because if Amelia Chapman was really Nick's daughter, then everything changed. Everything. The days blurred together. A week passed. Then another. Amelia learned the rhythms of the house, when the staff moved through the corridors, when Roelle disappeared into meetings that lasted hours, when the mansion went quiet enough for her to breathe. She ate meals she didn't taste, slept in sheets that smelled of cedar and strangers, and tried not to think about how quickly captivity could start to feel like routine. She didn't see him often. He was a shadow at the edge of her days, a closed study door, footsteps in a distant hallway, the lingering scent of sandalwood in rooms he'd just left. When they did cross paths, he looked at her with those dark eyes and said nothing, and she told herself the silence was a mercy. It wasn't, but it was easier to pretend. The kitchen was quiet in the late afternoon light. Amelia stood at the counter with a knife in her hand, slicing tomatoes she didn't intend to eat. It was something to do, something normal, something that reminded her of the life she'd had before. The knife was too sharp. That was her first thought as the blade sliced through her palm instead of the tomato she'd been attempting to cut. Blood welled immediately, bright red against her pale skin, and she hissed through her teeth as pain bloomed hot and sudden. "You're bleeding." His voice came from the doorway, low, flat, carrying that edge of danger that seemed to follow him everywhere. Amelia spun toward the sound, her injured hand flying behind her back like a child caught stealing, her heart slamming against her ribs. Roelle stood, framed in the entrance, his shoulder braced against the door jamb, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the bandage still wrapped around his palm, and something about seeing that, seeing the evidence of what he'd done for her, made her throat tighten. "It's nothing." The words came out too fast, too defensive, and she watched his eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. He pushed off from the doorframe and moved toward her, each step measured and deliberate, and she forced herself to hold her ground even as every instinct screamed at her to retreat. He stopped at the counter beside her, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and something darker beneath it, and pulled open a drawer to retrieve a clean cloth. His movements were unhurried, precise, as if he had all the time in the world, as if her bleeding hand was a problem he'd anticipated and prepared for. "Let me." It wasn't a request. His hand extended toward her, palm up, waiting. The bandage on his own palm was visible now, white against his tan skin, and Amelia found herself staring at it instead of meeting his eyes. He'd cut himself for her, bled for her, and now he was offering to tend her wound with hands that had probably ended lives. Her fingers trembled as she placed her injured hand in his. His touch was gentle, impossibly, unexpectedly gentle. She watched him examine the cut with clinical detachment, watched his thumb brush away the blood to reveal the wound beneath, and felt her breath catch at the warmth of his skin against hers. Not deep. His voice was quiet, focused. "It won't need stitches." He pressed the cloth against her palm, applying steady pressure, and she found herself studying his face in profile. The sharp line of his jaw, the scar that traced along it like a river on a map, the dark sweep of his lashes against his cheek. "You're gentle." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she felt him go still beside her. His hands didn't pause in their work, but something in the air between them thickened, and she heard herself continue in a voice that didn't quite sound like her own. "For a killer." The silence that followed was heavy enough to drown in. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too far, thought she'd finally found the line that would make him show her the monster everyone claimed he was. But when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost sad. Killers can be gentle when it matters. He finished wrapping her hand with careful, precise movements, his fingers lingering against her wrist for just a moment longer than necessary. She could feel her pulse fluttering beneath his touch, could see his eyes drop to the place where his thumb rested against her veins, and the awareness that passed between them was electric, dangerous, and undeniable. Then he released her and stepped back, and the moment shattered like glass. "Be more careful with the knives." He was gone before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and Amelia stood alone in the kitchen with her bandaged hand pressed against her chest and the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. "What is wrong with me?" The question circled through her mind like a vulture, picking at the bones of her sanity. He was a killer, a criminal. The man who'd bought her like livestock and locked her in a gilded cage. She should hate him, should fear him, should spend every waking moment plotting her escape, instead of standing here with her pulse racing and her skin tingling where his fingers had been. But her body didn't seem to care about should. Her body remembered the way he'd cradled her hand like it was something precious, the way his voice had softened when he said, "Killers can be gentle." The way his eyes had dropped to her pulse point, as if he wanted to feel the evidence of what he did to her. "Stop it! Stop it! He's not gentle. He's not safe. He's the reason you're here." But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Thomas was the reason she was here. Thomas and his cowardice and his stolen money and his disappearing act. Roel was just the trap she'd walked into, the cage she'd chosen. And cages, she was beginning to realize, came in many forms. 3 days later, she found the bird. It was huddled in the corner of the garden, a small brown thing with a wing bent at the wrong angle and eyes bright with pain and fear. Amelia knelt in the grass without thinking, her hands reaching for the creature with the instincts she'd spent 3 years of veterinary school developing. "Shh, I've got you." Her voice came out soft, soothing, the same tone she'd used with frightened animals in the clinic before her life had fallen apart. The bird trembled in her palms, its heartbeat rapid against her fingers, and she cradled it against her chest as she examined the damaged wing. "What happened to it?" She didn't startle at his voice this time, She was learning to feel him before she heard him, learning to sense his presence like a change in air pressure. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. There it is again, that flutter in her chest, that awareness that prickled across her skin whenever he was near. She'd tried to ignore it, tried to bury it beneath fear and anger and common sense, but it kept rising to the surface like something that refuses to stay drowned. He's your captor, your buyer, the man who owns your mother's life. And you can't stop thinking about the way his hands felt on yours. I don't know. She kept her eyes on the bird, her fingers gentle as they probed the injury. Cat, maybe, or it flew into a window. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and intent, and something about being watched by him while she worked made her skin feel too tight. She focused on the bird, on the familiar rhythm of assessment and triage, and tried to ignore the way her heart was racing. This is insane. You're insane. Wings broken, but it'll heal. She said it with more confidence than she felt, her hands already working to stabilize the limb with strips torn from the hem of her shirt. The bird had gone still in her grip, trusting her in the way that injured animals sometimes did, surrendering to gentleness when fighting was no longer possible. Like you're surrendering? Is that what this is? You could have been a doctor. His voice was closer now, and when she looked up, he was standing right beside her, his shadow falling across her hands and the bird she held. His eyes weren't on the creature, they were on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She felt a smile tug at her lips, small and unexpected, the first real smile she'd felt since coming to this place. Veterinarian, actually. That's what I was studying. She returned her attention to the bird, finishing the makeshift splint with hands that knew what they were doing, even when the rest of her felt lost. Animals don't lie. The words came out quiet, almost to herself, but she saw him react from the corner of her eye, a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of his shoulders that she was learning to recognize. Neither do you. She looked up at that, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd appeared. There was something in his expression that she'd never seen before, something raw and wounded and almost desperate. You wear everything on your face. His voice was low, rough. Every fear, every hope, every question you're afraid to ask. She should have looked away, should have broken the connection before it could become something more. But his eyes held her captive, dark and deep and full of secrets she was beginning to crave. What questions? The bird shifted in her hands, reminding her that she was kneeling in the grass with a broken creature cradled against her chest, and the most dangerous man in Chicago standing close enough to touch. About me? He crouched down beside her, bringing his face level with hers, and she could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the weight he carried in every line of his body. About why I look at you the way I do. About what I see when I see your face. Her heart was pounding now, so loud she was sure he could hear it. What do you see? The question hung between them, fragile and enormous. His hand came up, hovering near her cheek without quite touching, and she watched something break open behind his eyes. 18 years of grief and guilt and desperate searching, all of it rising to the surface before he could push it back down. Someone I've been looking for a very long time. Then he was standing, stepping back, the mask sliding back into place like it had never slipped at all. Take care of the bird, Amelia. She watched him walk away, his silhouette growing smaller against the afternoon light, and felt something shift in the landscape between them.
The bird stirred in her hands, warm and alive, and fighting to survive, and she held it closer against her chest, as if it could anchor her to something real. He was hiding something. Something about her, about why he'd married her, about the way he looked at her like she was a ghost made flesh. The words echoed through her mind. Someone I've been looking for a very long time. And she turned them over and over, searching for meaning in syllables that felt like keys to a door she hadn't known existed. And she was going to find out what it was, even if it destroyed them both. She didn't see the figure watching from the second-floor window, didn't notice the way Darden's cold eyes tracked her movements across the garden, or the way his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. But Besnick did. "Your uncle." Besnick's voice was low as he fell into step beside Roel in the corridor. "He's been watching her, every day, following her through the house." Roel's stride didn't falter, but his jaw tightened in a way that Besnick had learned to recognize over 20 years of friendship. "I know. He's planning something, the way he looks at her. I said I know." The words came out harder than Roel intended, sharp enough to cut. He stopped walking, his hand pressing flat against the wall, as if he needed something solid to anchor him. "Darden has always wanted what's mine. This is no different." "This is very different." Besnick stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "She's not a business deal or a territory dispute. She's your wife. And if he moves against her, he won't." Roel's eyes lifted to meet Besnick's, and what burned there made even his oldest friend take a step back. "Because if he touches her, I will end him, family or not. Blood or not." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had just been said. "Watch her," Roel said finally. "Every moment I can't." "Don't let her out of your sight." Besnick nodded once and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Roel alone with the ghost of green eyes and the growing certainty that the walls around him were beginning to crack. The photograph changed everything. Roel stared at the image his men had finally unearthed. A wedding photo from 2003, yellowed with age, pulled from a church archive in the Albanian Quarter. Nick Marcoux stood in the center, younger than Roel remembered, his arm wrapped around a woman with dark hair and a shy smile. Mira Marcoux. Before she became Margaret Miller, before she disappeared with a 3-year-old daughter and rewrote her entire existence. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same bone structure, the same tilt of the head, the same quiet strength hiding behind soft features. Margaret Chapman was Mira Marcoux, and that meant Amelia was Nick's daughter. His hand trembled as he set the photograph down, and he pressed his palm flat against the desk to steady himself. The wound had healed, leaving behind a thin scar that would fade with time, but the weight of what it represented had only grown heavier. He'd married Nick's daughter, the child of the man who'd saved his life, the man he'd failed to save in return, the man whose dying words had haunted him for 18 years. "Protect my little girl." And now she was sleeping down the hall, wearing his ring, bearing his name, looking at him with those impossible green eyes that saw too much and understood too little. He should tell her. He knew that. Every day that passed without the truth was another brick in the wall of lies he was building between them, another betrayal added to the mountain of sins he'd already committed against her family. But every time he thought about forming the words, he saw her face, the way she'd smiled at him in the garden, the way she'd trusted him with her bleeding hand, the way she looked at him like he might not be a monster after all. And he couldn't do it, couldn't watch that fragile trust shatter into 1,000 pieces. Coward, he thought, you're a coward. The accusation rang true, and he had no defense against it. She found him on the terrace at sunset, the city spread out below them like a carpet of fading gold. Amelia had been looking for him for days, ever since the garden, ever since he told her she was someone he'd been searching for, and then walked away without explanation. The words had lodged themselves beneath her skin like splinters, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore them, they kept working their way deeper. He stood at the railing with his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath the white fabric of his shirt, and something about the way the dying light caught his breath catch in her throat. "You're staring again." The words came out before she could stop them, and she watched him turn toward her with that slow, deliberate movement she was learning to recognize. His eyes found hers, dark and deep and full of something that made her pulse skip. "I can't help it." His voice was low, rough at the edges, and Amelia felt heat bloom across her skin at the weight of his gaze. He wasn't hiding it anymore, the hunger, the want, the desperate pull that seemed to draw them together despite every wall they tried to build. She moved toward him without deciding to, her feet carrying her across the terrace until she stood close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to smell sandalwood and whiskey, and something underneath that was purely him. Why? The question came out barely a whisper, and she watched his jaw tighten, watched his hands curl into fists at his sides. "Because you're the most dangerous thing in my life." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her lips part in surprise. She'd expected many things from him: coldness, distance, the impenetrable mask he wore like armor, but not this, not honesty. "I'm dangerous to you?" The question scraped past her lips before she could stop it, and she shook her head slowly, trying to make sense of words that refused to fit together. She was nothing, a debtor's daughter, a veterinary student with an interrupted education, and a dying mother, and no power at all. He was the one with the empire, the army, the ability to destroy lives with a phone call. Her hands trembled at her sides, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to still them. "How could I possibly be dangerous to you?" He took another step closer, and suddenly the air between them felt electric, charged with something that made her skin prickle and her heart race. She could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the tension coiled in every line of his body, the way his eyes darkened as they dropped to her mouth. "You have no idea." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to retreat, and when she didn't move, his fingers brushed against her cheek with a tenderness that stole her breath. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slid lower, stopped at the corner of her mouth. She was trembling. She could feel it, a fine vibration that started somewhere deep in her core and radiated outward until her whole body hummed with anticipation. "Rohel." His name died on her lips as he closed the distance between them, and then his mouth was on hers, and the world fell away. The kiss started soft, a question, an exploration, a first tentative step into unknown territory. His lips moved against hers with devastating gentleness, learning her shape, her taste, the small sounds she made in the back of her throat. He tasted of whiskey and something darker, something that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate wanting, and she drank him in like a woman dying of thirst. She felt his hand slide into her hair, felt his fingers tangle in the strands and tug gently until her head tipped back. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against the solid wall of his chest until there was no space left between them, until she could feel his heart hammering against her own. And then something shifted. The gentleness gave way to hunger, weeks of tension and denial collapsing into a single point of desperate need. His mouth claimed hers with an intensity that left her breathless, his tongue sweeping against her lower lip until she opened for him, and the sound he made when she did, low and raw and almost pained, sent liquid heat pooling in her belly. Her hands found his shoulders, his neck, the short hair at his nape. She rose on her toes to get closer, to taste more of him, and felt his arm tighten around her waist until she was barely touching the ground. He kissed like he did everything, with complete focus, absolute control, and a barely leashed intensity that promised destruction if it ever broke free. She felt consumed by him, devoured, and she wanted more, wanted everything, wanted to burn in the fire he'd started and never look back. Her fingers found the scar on his jaw, traced its length, while his mouth moved to her throat, and she heard herself gasp as his teeth grazed the sensitive skin below her ear. His breath came hot against her neck, ragged and uneven, and she felt his whole body shudder as her nails scraped lightly against his scalp. "Come with me." The words were rough, scraped raw with want, and she felt them vibrate against her throat where his lips still pressed. She didn't hesitate, didn't think, just nodded, her voice lost somewhere in the heat between them, and let him take her hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and he led her through the terrace doors, down the corridor, into the bedroom with its white sheets and its floor-to-ceiling windows, and its memories of blood sacrificed for her honor. The door clicked shut behind them, and then his mouth was on hers again, hungrier now, more demanding. His fingers found the buttons of her blouse, working them open one by one, while his lips traced fire down her neck. Each button that came undone felt like a barrier falling, a wall crumbling, and she arched into him as the fabric parted. She felt the cool air hit her skin, felt his sharp intake of breath as he pulled back to look at her. His eyes traveled down her body with an intensity that made her feel beautiful and terrified all at once, and she watched his throat work as he swallowed. Beautiful. The word was reverent, almost worshipful, and she felt tears prick at her eyes at the way he was looking at her, like she was something precious, something sacred, something he didn't deserve. Her hands went to his shirt, fumbling with buttons, desperate to feel his skin against hers. He helped her, shrugging off the fabric, and then there was nothing between them but the thin lace of her bra and the heat radiating from his body. She let her fingers explore the planes of his chest, the ridges of muscle, the scars that mapped his skin like stories she wanted to learn by heart. He lowered her to the bed, his weight pressing her into the mattress, his mouth finding hers again in a kiss that tasted like need and something dangerously close to desperation. Her legs wrapped around him instinctively, pulling him closer, and she felt the evidence of his want press against her thigh. His hand slid up her ribcage, leaving trails of fire in its wake, and she arched into his touch with a sound that didn't quite sound like her own voice. Higher. He was moving higher, his thumb brushing the underside of her breast, and she was drowning, dying, dissolving into sensation. "Wait!" The word came out strangled, broken, and she felt him freeze above her. His whole body went rigid, his breath coming in harsh gasps, and when she opened her eyes, she saw something shatter behind his. The thought crashed through him like ice water, drowning the heat, killing the hunger, leaving nothing but the cold weight of what he was doing. He was about to cross a line he could never uncross. Not with her, not like this, not while she looked up at him with those green eyes full of trust and want, and something that looked terrifyingly like the beginning of love. And she didn't even know.
Didn't know who she was, who he was, what he'd done to her family. Didn't know that every time he touched her, he was betraying the memory of a man who had died, believing Roel would keep his daughter safe. He couldn't do this, couldn't touch her without telling her, couldn't take what she was offering when she didn't know the price. "What's wrong?" Her voice came out breathless, confused, and she reached for him with trembling fingers. But he was already pulling away, sitting up, putting distance between them that felt like miles. His hands were shaking, she could see them trembling as he dragged his fingers through his hair, and his face had gone pale beneath the tan. The air between them turned cold so quickly it made her shiver. "I can't do this to you." The words landed like blows, and Amelia felt something cold spread through her chest. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheet around herself, the silk cool against her heated skin. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to find the moment where everything had shifted. "To me?" Her voice came out small, wounded, and she hated the vulnerability in it. She watched him stand, watched him pace to the window, watched him press his forehead against the glass like he was trying to push through it. His shoulders rose and fell with ragged breaths, and she could see the tension corded in his neck, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Or to yourself?" The question hung between them, sharp and searching. She saw his shoulders tense, saw his fists clench at his sides, saw the war playing out across his features in the reflection of the window. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak, and she thought he might not answer at all. "Both." The admission came out barely a whisper, and then he was moving toward the door, grabbing his shirt from the floor, not looking at her. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, so unlike the controlled grace she'd come to expect from him. "Roel!" She scrambled off the bed, the sheet clutched against her chest, her heart pounding with something that felt like panic. Her bare feet hit the cold floor, and she stumbled forward, reaching for him without thinking. "What are you hiding from me?" He stopped with his hand on the doorframe, his back rigid, his head bowed. She could see the rise and fall of his shoulders, could hear the ragged edge of his breathing in the silence. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything he wasn't saying, and she felt each second like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Something that will make you hate me." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Then the door opened. The door closed, and Amelia stood alone in the room where he'd bled for her, surrounded by the ghost of his touch and the echo of words that made no sense. "Something that will make you hate me." What could possibly be that terrible? What secret could be so devastating that it made him stop, made him pull away, made him look at her like touching her was a sin he couldn't commit? She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body still humming with unsatisfied want, her mind racing through every interaction, every glance, every cryptic phrase he'd ever spoken. "Someone I've been looking for a very long time. You're the most dangerous thing in my life. Something that will make you hate me." The pieces were there, scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, but she couldn't see the picture they formed. Not yet. But she would. Whatever he was hiding, whatever truth he was protecting her from, she would find it, even if it destroyed them both. Sleep wouldn't come. Amelia lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her body still humming with the memory of his hands, and her mind racing through the wreckage of what had almost happened. The sheets felt too smooth against her skin, the room too quiet, the space beside her too empty. She rolled onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow, but his words followed her into the darkness. "Something that will make you hate me." The words circled through her head like vultures, picking at the bones of her understanding. She pressed her palms against her eyes until colors bloomed in the darkness, trying to make sense of a man who kissed her like she was oxygen, and then walked away like touching her would kill him.
3 weeks ago, she'd been terrified of him. 3 weeks ago, she'd tried to climb a wall to escape this gilded prison. And now here she was, aching for a man who'd bought her, wanting things she shouldn't want, feeling things she had no right to feel. Her nails dug into her palms, leaving crescents in the soft flesh. Was this Stockholm Syndrome? Trauma bonding with her captor? The explanation seemed too neat, too clinical for the chaos inside her chest. He hadn't hurt her, hadn't touched her without permission, had cut his own flesh rather than take what he could have demanded. What kind of captor did that? What kind of monster showed more restraint than any man she'd ever known? Her mother's voice surfaced without warning, dragging her back to that hospital room, to the fear in Margaret's eyes when she'd seen the ring. Just like your... She'd been about to say something important, something that had frightened her enough to stop mid-sentence and pretend to sleep. Amelia's fingers twisted in the sheets, her heart beating faster. Just like your father? But Thomas Chapman was a coward who'd stolen money and run. There was nothing about Roel Rucci that resembled her father. Just like your... What? The question had no answer, only the gnawing certainty that her mother was hiding something, that everyone was hiding something, that she was trapped in a story whose beginning she didn't know and whose ending she couldn't see. A sound broke through the silence, muffled, distant, coming from somewhere down the hall. Amelia sat up slowly, her heart quickening, and listened. It came again. A voice. His voice, screaming. She found his door by following the sounds of a man drowning in his own nightmares. The room was dark, but moonlight spilled through the windows to illuminate the figure thrashing on the bed. The sheets had twisted around him like restraints, soaked with sweat that gleamed silver in the pale light. And his face, that controlled, impenetrable face, was contorted with an anguish she'd never seen him wear while waking. Nick! The name tore from his throat, raw and ragged, and Amelia felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. She'd never heard that name before, had no idea who it belonged to, or why it could make this man, this unshakable, untouchable man, sound like a child begging for forgiveness. "I'm sorry. I couldn't. I tried to." His body arched against the mattress, his hands clawing at something invisible, and the sound he made was more animal than human. She'd never heard pain like that. "Nick, please, I'm sorry. Don't leave me." She moved without thinking, crossing the room to his bedside, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Roll." His skin was burning beneath her palm, slick with sweat, and she could feel the tremors running through him like earthquakes. "Roel, wake up!" His eyes flew open, wild and unseeing, and before she could react, his hand had closed around her wrist with crushing force. She gasped at the pain, at the violence in his grip, but she didn't pull away. Her pulse hammered against his fingers, but she forced her voice to stay steady. "It's me. It's Amelia." "You're safe." Recognition flickered in his eyes, slow, painful, like a man clawing his way back from the depths of something terrible. His grip loosened, his breathing ragged, and then he was releasing her, scrambling back against the headboard, his chest heaving with the effort of finding himself again. She rubbed her wrist where his fingers had left marks, watching him struggle to reassemble himself. The moonlight caught the sweat still beading on his forehead, the way his hands trembled against the sheets, the wild look in his eyes that was only slowly fading. Who is Nick? The question hung between them, heavy with everything she didn't understand.
She watched him flinch at the name, watched his jaw clench so tight the tendons stood out in his neck. His knuckles went white where they gripped the sheets. No one. The lie was so obvious it was almost insulting. She sat down on the edge of his bed, close enough to see the sweat still beading on his forehead, the way his hands were shaking against the sheets. You were screaming his name. He didn't answer, just sat there with his back against the headboard, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, his face slowly rebuilding itself into the mask he wore like armor. She watched his chest rise and fall, watched him fight for control, breath by breath. Roel. She waited until he looked at her, until those dark eyes met hers with something that looked almost like fear. His throat worked as he swallowed, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, scraped raw from whatever hell he'd been visiting in his dreams. Some ghosts don't stay buried. His hands curled into fists against his thighs, knuckles white, and she watched him wage a war she couldn't see. The moonlight carved shadows into his face, making him look older, more tired, more human than she'd ever seen him. I'm not afraid of ghosts. She reached for him slowly, giving him time to pull away, and when he didn't move, she laid her hand over his fist. His skin was still fever-hot, still trembling, and she felt him tense at the contact. A muscle jumped in his jaw. You should be afraid of mine. He pulled his hand away and rose from the bed in a single fluid motion, putting distance between them. The moonlight caught the scars on his back, more than she'd realized, mapping his skin like a history of violence, and something in her chest ached at the sight of them. Then show me. She stood too, facing him across the rumpled sheets. He'd frozen at her words, his back still turned, his shoulders rigid with tension she could feel from across the room. She could see the rise and fall of his breathing, the way his hands opened and closed at his sides. You said I was someone you'd been looking for. She moved toward him, her bare feet silent on the carpet. You said I was the most dangerous thing in your life. You said you had something that would make me hate you. She stopped an arm's length behind him, close enough to see the rise and fall of his breathing, close enough to touch if she reached out. So show me, tell me, whatever it is. You don't know what you're asking. He turned then, and the look on his face stole her breath. Raw, wounded. The mask stripped away to reveal something human and hurting beneath. His eyes glistened in the moonlight, and she saw his hands trembling at his sides. I'm asking you. Her hand came up to touch his face, and she felt him shudder at the contact. His eyes closed, his jaw tight, every line of his body screaming with the effort of holding himself back. His skin was still hot beneath her palm, his pulse racing where her thumb brushed his jaw. Amelia. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a warning all at once. But she was tired of warnings, tired of questions with answers, tired of the space between them that he kept trying to maintain. I want you. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. She watched his eyes fly open, dark and desperate, and saw the last of his control begin to crack. His breath caught, his hands curling into fists at his sides, every muscle in his body going rigid. Say it again. His voice was barely a whisper, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw with a tenderness that made her throat tight. She remembered his promise from their wedding night, I'll make you ask twice, to be sure, and felt something warm spread through her chest. He was giving her a choice.
Even now, even with his control in tatters and his body trembling with want, he was making sure she knew what she was choosing. "I want you, Roel." The words had barely left her lips before his mouth found hers. The kiss was different this time, slower, deeper, tasting of surrender on both sides. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, and she felt the last wall between them crumble into dust. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, carrying her back to the bed they'd fled from moments before. The sheets were still warm from his nightmares, still tangled from his thrashing, and she pulled him down into them without fear. This time, he didn't stop. His hands found the hem of her nightgown and paused there, fingers brushing against her thighs with a question she answered by arching into his touch. The fabric slid upward, inch by inch, his knuckles grazing her skin and leaving trails of fire in their wake. She heard herself gasp when the cool air hit her stomach, her ribs, the curve of her breasts. His eyes darkened at the sound, hungry and reverent all at once, and she felt powerful in a way she'd never felt before. "Look at me." His voice was rough, commanding, and she opened eyes she hadn't realized she'd closed. He was watching her face with an intensity that made her feel more naked than the nightgown pooled around her shoulders ever could. She pulled the fabric over her head herself and watched his breath catch at the sight of her. His eyes traveled down her body slowly, and she felt heat bloom everywhere his gaze touched. Her skin prickled under his attention, her nipples tightening, her body responding to him without her permission. "Beautiful." The word came out wrecked, broken. "You have no idea what you do to me." His hands finally touched her shoulders, her collarbone, the swell of her breasts, and she arched into him with a moan she couldn't contain. Every nerve ending was alive, singing, screaming for more. He kissed her then, deep and claiming, while his hands learned the geography of her body. His mouth followed his fingers, pressing kisses into the hollow of her throat, the curve of her breast, and when his lips closed around her nipple, she cried out, her fingers tangling in his hair. "Roll!" His name came out like a plea, and she felt him groan against her skin, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through her and made her hips buck up against him. His hand slid down her stomach, lower, and she gasped at the first brush of his fingers where she ached for him most. When he finally settled between her thighs, she tensed despite herself, her nails digging into his shoulders. He stilled immediately, his forehead dropping to hers, his breathing ragged. She could feel him trembling with the effort of holding back, could see the strain in his jaw, the cords standing out in his neck. "I know it's your first time." His voice was strained, his arms trembling with the effort of holding back. "Tell me if it's too much." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and felt him shift against her. The first press of him made her gasp, not from pain, not yet, but from the overwhelming intimacy of it. He moved slowly, watching her face, and she gripped his shoulders as her body learned to accommodate him. There was pain, a sharp, burning stretch that made her breath hitch, but he stopped the moment he saw it in her eyes, holding himself still with a control that made his jaw clench tight. "Breathe, baby." The endearment melted something inside her. She pulled air into her lungs, felt her body slowly relax around him, and watched relief flood his features. His thumb stroked her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Move," the word came out broken. "Please." His eyes searched hers one last time, and then he did. Slow at first, gentle, but building into something that stole her breath and scattered her thoughts until there was nothing left but sensation. The weight of him, the heat of him, the way he whispered her name like a prayer against her skin. When she shattered, it was with his name on her lips and his arms around her, and the terrifying certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The world fell away. After, when her breathing had slowed and her heart had stopped trying to escape her chest, she curled into him and felt his arms wrap around her like she was something worth protecting. His lips pressed against her hair, her forehead, the tip of her nose, and she felt tears prick at her eyes at the tenderness of it. "Did I hurt you?" The concern in his voice made her chest ache. She could feel his heart still racing beneath her palm, could feel the tension in his body as he waited for her answer. No, she pressed closer, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat against her cheek, letting it anchor her to this moment. "You didn't hurt me." His arms tightened around her, and she felt him exhale, a long, shuddering breath that spoke of relief and something deeper she couldn't name. For the first time since entering this house, she felt safe. And then the truth hit her, sudden, devastating, impossible to ignore.
Her breath caught in her throat, her fingers curling against his chest, and she felt her heart stutter in her rib cage. She loved him. The realization bloomed in her chest like a wound opening, sharp and sweet and terrifying all at once. She loved him. This man who'd bought her, caged her, bled for her. This man who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. This man who held her like she might disappear if he let go. She should be horrified, should be fighting against the feeling, burying it beneath logic and self-preservation, and the simple fact that loving your captor was textbook trauma response. But her heart didn't care about textbooks. Her heart only knew the way he'd touched her, like she was sacred, like she was precious, like hurting her would destroy him. She pressed closer against his chest, hiding her face against his skin so he wouldn't see the tears that were suddenly threatening to spill. Loving him was madness. Loving him was suicide. Loving him meant giving him the power to shatter her completely. But it was too late. She'd already fallen, and she had no idea how to survive the landing. Roel lay in the gray light of early dawn, watching Amelia sleep. She was curled against him, her head on his chest, her hair spread across his skin like dark water. Her breathing was slow and even, her face soft with a piece he'd stolen from her with every touch, every kiss, every moment he'd let himself pretend he had the right to hold her. His jaw clenched, and he felt his arm tighten around her involuntarily. He'd made love to Nick's daughter, had held her while she came apart in his arms, had whispered her name against her skin, had lost himself in her so completely that for a few perfect hours he'd forgotten everything except the way she felt beneath him. And he still hadn't told her the truth. His free hand curled into a fist against the sheets, self-loathing rising in his throat like bile. Coward, that's what he was. A coward who couldn't face the woman sleeping in his arms and tell her the truth about who she was, who he was, what he'd done to her family. She stirred against him, making a small sound of contentment, and something cracked in the vicinity of his heart. He should tell her now, should wake her and confess everything, who she was, who he was, what he'd done and failed to do 18 years ago. She deserved to know. She deserved to hate him. But her face was so peaceful, her body so warm against his, and he was so tired of carrying this weight alone.
He pressed his lips to her hair, breathing in the scent of her, and made himself a promise he already knew he'd break. One more day, just one more day of this, and then he'd tell her everything.
The lie was comfortable, familiar. He'd been telling it to himself for weeks now, and every day the truth grew heavier and the confession grew harder. She shifted in her sleep, her arm tightening around his waist, and murmured something he couldn't quite hear. His chest constricted, and he felt his eyes burn with something he refused to name. He loved her. The realization hit him like a blade between the ribs, sudden, devastating, undeniable. He loved Nick's daughter, loved the woman he'd bought to pay a debt that could never be repaid, loved her and lied to her and held her in the same arms that had failed to save her father.
And when she found out, when, not if, because the truth always surfaced eventually, she would hate him exactly as much as he deserved. But for now, in the gray light of morning, with her warmth pressed against him and her breath soft on his skin, he let himself pretend that this could last, that he could be the man she thought he was, that love was enough to outrun the ghosts that would eventually come for them both.
3 days of stolen happiness. 3 days of waking up tangled in his sheets, his arm heavy across her waist, his breath warm against her neck. 3 days of learning the geography of his body, the scar beneath his ribs, the tattoo in Albanian script across his shoulder blade, the way his eyes softened when he thought she wasn't looking. 3 days of pretending this was real. But even in the warmth of his arms, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He held her like she might disappear, watched her like he was memorizing her face. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between touches, she caught him looking at her with an expression that looked terrifyingly like grief. She pressed her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt the question rise in her throat before she could stop it. That name, the one he'd screamed in his nightmares, the one he'd refused to explain. It hung between them like smoke, impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. Who was Nick? And why did his ghost haunt the man she was falling for? The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and dying flowers, and Margaret looked smaller than Amelia remembered, her skin paper-thin, her eyes clouded with medication, her fingers trembling where they rested on the white sheets. "Mom!" Amelia took her hand, feeling the bones beneath the skin, the fragile pulse of life that seemed weaker with each visit. The treatment was working. The doctors said so. But looking at her mother now, she couldn't help wondering what they were really fighting for. "Amelia," Margaret's voice came out thready, distant. "You came." "I always come." She squeezed her mother's fingers gently, watching the flutter of her eyelids, the way her chest rose and fell with each labored breath. Something flickered in her mother's eyes, a moment of clarity breaking through the fog of pain medication. Her fingers tightened around Amelia's hand with surprising strength, and when she spoke again, her voice held an urgency that made Amelia's stomach clench. "The doctors came this morning." Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes growing wet. "They said, they're not sure how much longer. I need to tell you, before I can't anymore." Amelia felt her throat tighten, felt the familiar fear that lived in her chest whenever she walked into this room. She leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's forehead. "Tell me what, Mom?" "The box." The words came out urgent, fractured. "In my closet, at the house." Amelia's brow furrowed, her pulse quickening despite herself. Her free hand gripped the bed rail, knuckles going white. "What box, Mom?" Margaret's eyes drifted closed, and for a moment Amelia thought she'd lost her to sleep again.
But then they opened, sharp, clear, more lucid than they'd been in weeks. Things you need to know. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, and Amelia had to lean in until her ear was inches from her mother's lips. About your father. Your real father. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She'd always known Thomas wasn't her biological father. He'd come into their lives when she was 6, married her mother, given them his name and his quiet, steady presence. But her real father had always been a ghost, a silence, a photograph she'd never seen, and a name she'd never been told. "Mom, you never talk about him." Her voice came out careful, barely above a whisper. "You always said he died when I was little. That's all I know." "There's more." Margaret's eyes were sharp now, cutting through the haze of medication with an intensity that made Amelia's skin prickle. Her grip tightened almost painfully. "So much more. Things I should have told you years ago." "What things? Mom, what?" But Margaret's eyes were already closing, her grip loosening, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of medicated sleep. Amelia sat there for a long time, holding her mother's hand, watching the rise and fall of her chest, her mind racing through implications she couldn't begin to understand. Her real father? The man she'd never known, never asked about, because the questions always made her mother's face go pale and closed. What had Margaret been hiding all these years? The driver didn't question her when she gave him her mother's address instead of the mansion. He was paid not to question, paid to drive wherever the boss's wife wanted to go. And right now, Amelia was grateful for the silence that money could buy. The house felt wrong without her mother in it. Amelia moved through rooms that smelled of dust and absence, past furniture shrouded in white sheets, past photographs she couldn't bear to look at. Her hands were shaking as she climbed the stairs to her mother's bedroom, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it echoing off the walls. The closet door creaked when she opened it. Margaret's clothes hung in neat rows, organized by color the way they'd always been. And for a moment, Amelia just stood there, breathing in the faint scent of her mother's perfume, lavender and something softer, something that smelled like childhood and safety and 1,000 bedtime stories. The box was in the back corner, hidden behind winter coats and forgotten shoes. Wooden, old, with brass hinges that had gone green with age. Amelia's fingers trembled as she pulled it out, as she carried it to the bed, as she lifted the lid on a truth 18 years in the making. Photographs, dozens of them, yellowed with age, showing faces she didn't recognize. A man with dark hair and kind eyes. Green eyes, she realized with a jolt that made her hands shake harder. The same shade as her own. She lifted the photograph closer, studying the face of a stranger who somehow felt familiar. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes in a way that made her chest ache. There were more. A woman who looked like Margaret, but younger, softer, with a smile she'd never seen on her mother's face, open, unguarded, full of a happiness that seemed almost foreign. And a baby, a little girl with dark curls and those same green eyes, held in the arms of the man who must have been her father. Her hands shook as she sorted through the pictures, as the truth assembled itself from fragments she couldn't deny. There were documents, too. A marriage certificate for Nick Marcoux and Mira Marcoux, dated 2003. A birth certificate for Amelia Marcoux, born 2004. She stared at the name until the letters blurred. Marcoux. Her name was Marcoux. Not Chapman, not Miller. Marcoux. She pressed her hand against her mouth, feeling the sob building in her chest, and forced herself to keep looking. At the bottom of the box, a newspaper clipping. Old, fragile, the paper almost falling apart in her hands. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as the headline swam into focus. Albanian community mourns loss of Nicholas Marku. The article was brief. A man killed in what police called a gang-related incident, leaving behind a wife and young daughter. No arrests, no suspects. The kind of death that happened in certain communities and was never spoken of again. Her stomach turned to ice. She knew what gang-related meant now.
Had learned enough in her weeks in Roel's world to understand the sanitized language of violence. Her father had been murdered. The box slipped from her fingers. Photographs scattered across the bedspread like fallen leaves, and Amelia sat frozen among the ruins of her identity, staring at the face of a man she'd never known. A sound escaped her throat, raw, wounded, the cry of a child who'd never had the chance to say the word that rose up from somewhere deep inside her. Daddy! She pressed her hand against her mouth to keep the sobs from escaping, but they came anyway, tearing through her chest like something with claws. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until there was nothing left but a hollow ache where her heart used to be. She didn't know how long she sat there. Hours, maybe. The light changed outside the window, afternoon fading into evening, evening bleeding into night, and still she couldn't move, couldn't process, couldn't reconcile the life she'd known with the truth scattered across her mother's bed. When she finally gathered the strength to move, her legs felt like water beneath her. She collected the photographs with numb fingers, placed them back in the box, and sat on the edge of the bed with her father's face cradled in her hands. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a connection was forming. A name she'd heard screamed in the darkness. A name that had haunted the man she'd given herself to. Nicholas. Nick. Her father's name was Nick, and Roel screamed that name in his nightmares. She didn't sleep that night. Amelia lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over the pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. The box sat on the nightstand beside her, its contents memorized now. Every photograph, every document, every fragment of a life that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to remember it. Her fingers curled into the sheets, her jaw clenching against the answer she didn't want to find. The connection couldn't be coincidence. Roel screaming her father's name. The grief in his eyes when he looked at her. The way he'd frozen at the altar, like he'd seen a ghost. What did her husband have to do with the murder of her father? When morning came, gray and cold and unforgiving, she went to find out. The internet gave her fragments, not answers. She sat in her mother's kitchen with her laptop open, searching through newspaper archives, old forum posts, anything she could find. Her fingers trembled against the keys as she typed her father's name into the search bar. Nicholas Marku, Chicago, 2007. The results were sparse. A brief obituary that said nothing, a few mentions in Albanian community forums, whispers and rumors that circled around a truth no one would speak directly. But one thread caught her attention. An old forum post, mostly deleted, but with enough fragments remaining to make her blood run cold. Marku was loyal to the end. Rucci family always takes care of their own. Betrayal accusation was bullshit. Everyone knew it. Rucci. She stared at the name until her vision blurred. She knew that name, wore it on her finger, slept beside it every night. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. She searched again, different terms this time, and found more fragments. Nothing concrete, nothing she could point to and say, this is proof, but enough. Enough to know that her father's death and her husband's family were connected in ways she was only beginning to understand. She closed a laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes until colors bloomed in the darkness. She needed proof.
needed to see it with her own eyes before she let herself believe that the man she loved had anything to do with her father's death. His study door was unlocked. Amelia moved through the darkened mansion like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the marble floors. Roel was out, some meeting she hadn't asked about, and the house was empty except for the staff who knew better than to question the boss's wife. The study smelled like him. Leather and whiskey and sandalwood, the scent that had become synonymous with safety and desire and 100 other things she'd been stupid enough to feel. Her chest ached at the familiarity of it, at the memories it conjured, his hands on her skin, his mouth against her throat, the way he whispered her name like a prayer. She pushed the memories aside and moved to his desk. It was immaculate, papers arranged in precise stacks, everything in its place. She started opening drawers, not sure what she was looking for, until she found it. A file, thick, worn, with her name written on the tab in handwriting she didn't recognize. It wasn't hidden, wasn't locked in a safe or buried beneath other documents. Just sitting there in the top drawer, as if part of him had been waiting for her to find it. As if the weight of carrying this secret alone had become too heavy even for him. Inside, photographs of her mother, of her, documents tracing Margaret Miller back to Mira Marcoux, a wedding photo of her parents, the same one she'd found in the box. And notes, handwritten notes in Roll's precise script dated weeks ago. The first line made her stomach drop. Margaret Chapman is Mira Marcoux. Confirmed. Below it, in the same careful handwriting, Amelia Chapman is Amelia Marcoux. She is Nick's daughter. And at the bottom, underlined twice, she doesn't know. She doesn't remember. The file slipped from her numb fingers, papers scattering across the floor like leaves in autumn. Her legs gave out, and she grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from falling, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that tore at her throat. He knew. He'd known for weeks, had looked at her every day, touched her every night, and never said a word. Amelia. She spun toward the voice, her heart slamming against her ribs. Roel stood in the doorway, his face pale in the dim light, his eyes fixed on the papers at her feet. He was still wearing his coat, his keys still in his hand, and she realized he must have come straight here the moment he learned she was back. The silence between them stretched like a wire about to snap. You knew. The words came out small, broken, nothing like an accusation, more like the sound of something shattering. Her hands were trembling, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. He took a step toward her, and she flinched back so hard her hips slammed into the desk. The pain barely registered. All she could see was his face, pale, stricken, guilty. Amelia. My father. Her voice cracked on the word, tears already spilling down her cheeks. His name was Nicholas Marcoux, Nick. She watched his face as she said it, watched the color drain from his skin, watched his jaw clench so tight the tendons stood out in his neck. His hand gripped the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him upright. You knew him. It came out as a whisper, fragile and afraid. You scream his name in your sleep. Roel's eyes closed, and she saw his chest heave with a breath that seemed to cost him everything. When he opened them again, they were wet. Yes, the word came out barely a whisper. I knew him. Something inside her crumbled. The last fragile hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that there was some explanation that would make everything okay. She felt her knees buckle and grabbed the edge of the desk to stay upright, her whole body shaking. What happened to him?
The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating.
She watched him struggle, watched the war play out across his features, the mask crumbling to reveal something raw and wounded beneath. "He was killed," Roel's voice came out hollow, scraped empty. "By my family, on my father's orders. They said he was a traitor." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her legs gave out completely, and she sank to the floor, her back against the desk, her hand pressed over her mouth to muffle the sob that tore out of her throat. The papers from the file scattered around her like fallen leaves, her father's face staring up at her from a dozen photographs. "Were you there?" She didn't want to ask, didn't want to know. But the question escaped anyway, small and broken, the voice of a child asking a question no child should ever have to ask. Roel's head bowed, his shoulders curling inward like he was trying to protect himself from a blow that had already landed. His hands hung at his sides, trembling. Yes. One word, one syllable, and it shattered the last piece of her heart. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there on the cold floor of his study, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, while the world she thought she knew collapsed around her. She waited for him to say something else, an explanation, a defense, anything that would help her understand. But he just stood there in the doorway, frozen, silent, tears streaming down his face. "Why?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" His throat worked as he swallowed, but no words came out. She could see him struggling, could see the words trapped behind his teeth, fighting to get free, but he couldn't seem to make himself say them. "You knew who I was." Her voice trembled, cracking on every word. "You knew I was his daughter, and you touched me. You made me believe." She couldn't finish. The sob tore through her, bending her in half, and she pressed her forehead against her knees and wept. Not at first. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "I didn't know until after the wedding." "Until I saw your eyes, and I realized, but you found out." She lifted her head, and the look on her face made him take a step back. Not anger, something worse, something devastated. "You found out, and you didn't tell me. You let me fall in love with you. You let me give myself to you. And the whole time you knew that your family—" Her voice broke. She couldn't say it, couldn't make her mouth form the words, "murdered my father." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them could say. She saw him take a step toward her, saw his hand reach out, like he wanted to help her up, to hold her, to comfort her the way he had so many times before. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the desk, her eyes wide with something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "Don't!" The words stopped him cold. His hand fell to his side, and she watched something break behind his eyes. "I fell in love with you." The confession came out raw, bleeding, nothing like the weapon she'd meant it to be. "I fell in love with you, and you knew. The whole time, you knew." He didn't try to defend himself, didn't offer excuses or explanations, just stood there, accepting it, like he believed he deserved every word. Something snapped inside her, not anger, but grief so deep it felt like drowning. She pushed herself up from the floor on shaking legs, one hand braced against the desk for support. Her whole body was trembling, her vision blurred with tears, her chest aching with a pain that had no name. She walked toward him on unsteady feet, and she saw him brace himself, for words, for accusations, for whatever she was about to do.
Her hand came up, and before she knew what she was doing, her palm connected with his cheek. The crack echoed through the silent room. He didn't flinch, didn't try to block it, just stood there and took it, his eyes never leaving hers, his cheek turning red where she'd struck him. "I trusted you." The words came out as a whisper, broken and small. "I trusted you, and you—" She couldn't finish. The sobs were coming too fast now, tearing through her chest, stealing her breath. She wrapped her arms around herself and stumbled backward, putting distance between them. "I can't be here." Her voice was barely audible. "I can't look at you. I can't." Something shattered behind his eyes. She watched it happen, watched the light go out, watched him accept a sentence she hadn't quite pronounced. His shoulders dropped, his hands fell to his sides, and when he spoke again, his voice was empty. "I'll have a car take you to your mother's house." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. "Stay as long as you need." She walked past him without looking back. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, carrying her down the hallway, down the stairs, out the front door. The driver was waiting. He was always waiting. And she climbed into the back seat and curled into herself like a child. As the mansion disappeared behind her, Amelia pressed her forehead against the cold window and let herself fall apart. The man she loved had watched her father die, and she had no idea how she was supposed to survive that. The bedroom of her childhood felt like a museum of someone else's life. Amelia sat on the edge of the bed she'd slept in for 18 years, surrounded by posters of bands she no longer listened to and photographs of a girl who no longer existed. The morning light filtered through curtains she'd picked out when she was 12, purple with white stars, childish and hopeful, and she wondered how she'd ever been that innocent. 3 days since she'd walked out of Roll's mansion. 3 days since she'd learned that her entire life was built on lies. 3 days since she'd slapped the man she loved and watched something shatter behind his eyes. She turned the photograph over in her hands, studying her father's face for the 100th time. Nicholas Marcoux. Nick. He had her eyes, or rather, she had his. The same shade of green, the same slight tilt at the corners. She traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his smile, trying to memorize features she should have known her whole life. Her throat tightened as she pressed the photograph against her chest, feeling the sharp edges dig into her skin through her thin shirt. She'd cried so much in the past 3 days that her eyes felt raw, scraped empty, but somehow the tears kept coming. They leaked out now, hot and silent, tracking down cheeks that had forgotten how to be dry. The house was too quiet. Mrs. Patterson, the home nurse who checked on the house while Margaret was in the hospital, had left hours ago. The silence pressed in on Amelia from all sides, broken only by the occasional creak of old floorboards settling and the distant sound of traffic outside. She should go to the hospital, should sit beside her mother's bed and hold her hand and pretend everything was fine. But she couldn't make herself move. Couldn't face the questions in Margaret's eyes, the gentle probing about why she'd come home, why she looked like she hadn't slept in days, why she flinched every time her phone buzzed with another unanswered call from the mansion. Her phone lit up again on the nightstand. She didn't look at it. She already knew who it was. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and artificial flowers, and Amelia's footsteps echoed too loud against the linoleum as she made her way to her mother's room. She'd finally forced herself to come after 2 more days of silence, 2 more days of staring at walls and crying until she had nothing left. Margaret was awake when she pushed open the door, propped up against a mountain of pillows with an IV drip feeding into her thin arm. Her eyes, tired but sharp, always sharp, tracked Amelia as she crossed the room and sank into the chair beside the bed. "You look terrible." Margaret's voice was weak, thready, but the concern underneath it was unmistakable. Her hand found Amelia's, her fingers cool and dry. "You haven't been sleeping." Amelia tried to smile, but her face wouldn't cooperate. Her lips trembled, and she had to look away, had to focus on the steady beep of the heart monitor instead of the worry in her mother's eyes. "I'm fine." "You're lying." Margaret squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "I've known you for 21 years, baby. I know when you're lying." The words cracked something open in Amelia's chest, and before she could stop herself, the whole story came spilling out. The box, the photographs, the newspaper clipping, Roel's file, his notes, his confession that he'd been there when her father died. She told her mother everything, the words tumbling over each other in their rush to escape. And when she finally fell silent, her face was wet with tears she didn't remember shedding. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing slow circles on Amelia's knuckles. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, marking the seconds that stretched between them. "I should have told you." Her mother's voice was barely above a whisper, heavy with 18 years of secrets and regret. "About your father, about who we were. I thought I was protecting you, but—" "You were." Amelia's voice cracked. "You were protecting me, Mom. I understand that now." Margaret shook her head, her eyes glistening. "I lied to you, every day for 18 years. And now you're angry at Roel for doing the same thing." Amelia flinched at the name, her hand tightening around her mother's. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the ways it was different, couldn't be the same. But the words stuck in her throat. "He was there, Mom." The words came out small, wounded. "When they killed Daddy. He was there." "I know." Margaret's free hand came up to touch Amelia's face, her fingers trembling against her daughter's cheek. "But baby, did he tell you why? Did he tell you what happened that night?" Amelia shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He said he was there, that his family did it, that he knew who I was and didn't tell me. And then Her voice broke. "I slapped him and left. I didn't let him explain." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching Amelia's face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Your father loved Roel." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "Did you know that? Nick talked about him all the time. The boy with the hard father and the soft heart, he used to say. He was so proud of that boy, so determined to protect him from his own family." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known, hadn't even thought to ask. "Sometimes people do terrible things to survive." Margaret's voice was fading now, exhaustion pulling at the edges of her words. "Sometimes they carry guilt that isn't theirs to carry, and sometimes—" She paused, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before opening again. "Sometimes love means giving someone the chance to explain, even when you're angry, even when you're hurt." The heart monitor beeped, the IV dripped, and Amelia sat there holding her mother's hand, turning those words over in her mind like stones worn smooth by water. "Get some rest, Mom." She leaned forward and pressed a kiss to Margaret's forehead, tasting salt from her own tears. "I'll come back tomorrow." Margaret's eyes were already closing, but her fingers tightened around Amelia's one last time. "He came to see me, you know." Her voice was barely a whisper now, slurred with approaching sleep. "Roel, the day after you left, he wanted to make sure I had everything I needed. He looked—" She paused, her brow furrowing. "He looked like a man who'd lost everything." Amelia didn't answer. Couldn't answer. She just sat there in the quiet of the hospital room, watching her mother drift into sleep, and felt the first tiny crack form in the wall she'd built around her heart. 3 days of darkness. Roll sat in his study with the curtains drawn, the same clothes he'd been wearing when Amelia walked out still hanging off his frame. The bottle of whiskey on his desk had been full 2 days ago, and now it was nearly empty, the amber liquid catching the thin sliver of light that crept through the gap in the curtains. He hadn't shaved, hadn't showered, hadn't eaten anything except the stale bread Besnick had forced on him yesterday, threatening to call a doctor if he didn't at least try to keep something down. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the hollow ache in his chest where his heart used to be. He lifted the glass to his lips, feeling the burn of the whiskey as it slid down his throat, and stared at the photograph on his desk. Amelia, laughing at something he'd said, her green eyes bright with a happiness he'd put there, a happiness he'd destroyed. The study door swung open without a knock. Only one person in the house would dare, and Besnick's familiar silhouette filled the doorway. His oldest friend stood there for a moment, taking in the scene with an expression caught somewhere between concern and disgust.
"You look like shit."
Roll raised the glass in a mocking salute, his lips twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile.
"Feel like it."
Besnick crossed the room in 3 long strides and yanked the curtains open, flooding the space with afternoon light that made Roll's eyes water and his head pound. He turned away from the brightness, reaching for the bottle on his desk, but Besnick got there first. 3 days, boss." His voice was gruff, but underneath it, Roll could hear the worry he was trying to hide. "You haven't left this room. You haven't showered. You're drinking yourself to death, and for what?" Roll's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the arms of his chair. He didn't answer. Didn't have the words to explain the void that had opened up inside him when Amelia walked out that door. The certainty that he'd finally become the monster he'd spent his whole life trying not to be. "She's gone." The words scraped out of his throat like broken glass. "I lost her, just like I lost him." Besnick was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face carved with something that might have been understanding. He'd been there, 18 years ago. He'd seen what Nick's death had done to Roel, the way it had hollowed him out and filled him with a guilt that never faded. "You didn't lose Nick." Besnick's voice was softer now, gentler than Roel had heard it in years. "Your father took him from you, just like he took everything else." Roel shook his head, the familiar weight of guilt settling back into his bones like an old friend. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to block out the memories that never stopped playing behind his eyelids. "I was there. I watched. I didn't stop it. You were 21 years old with a gun in your hand and your father's men watching to see if you'd obey." Besnick's hand landed on his shoulder, heavy and warm. "They used you. That wasn't your fault." Roel wanted to believe him. God, he wanted to believe him. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Nick's face, calm, accepting, forgiving, even as the bullet. The kitchen smelled like the tea she'd made hours ago and forgotten to drink. Amelia stood at the counter with the cold cup still in her hands, staring out the window at the darkening sky without really seeing it. Her mother's words kept echoing through her head, refusing to let her rest. He looked like a man who'd lost everything. She tried to push the thought away, tried to focus on her anger, her grief, her sense of betrayal. But underneath it all, something else was stirring, something that felt terrifyingly like doubt. The sound came from behind her, soft, almost silent, the whisper of a footstep on linoleum. She started to turn, her brow furrowing in confusion, because Mrs. Patterson had left hours ago, and she was supposed to be alone. A hand clamped over her mouth. The cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, cold tea splashing across her bare feet, but she barely felt it. Panic surged through her, white-hot and blinding, as she was yanked backward against a hard chest. She fought, kicked and clawed and bit at the hand covering her mouth, tasting leather and something chemical that made her head swim. But there were more of them. She could see shadows moving in her peripheral vision, could feel another set of hands grabbing her arms and wrenching them behind her back. A scream built in her throat, but the hand over her mouth pressed harder, cutting off her air until stars exploded behind her eyes. She felt rope bite into her wrists, felt something soft and dark slide over her eyes, felt herself being lifted off her feet and carried through the kitchen she'd grown up in. Cold air hit her face. They were outside now, moving fast, and then she was being shoved into something metal and hard. A van, maybe. The floor was freezing against her cheek, and she could hear voices above her, speaking in a language she didn't understand. The engine roared to life, and the van lurched forward, and Amelia lay there in the darkness with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Time lost all meaning. Minutes or hours, she couldn't tell. The van turned and turned again, the motion making her stomach heave, and all she could do was lie there and try to breathe through the panic that was clawing at her throat. She thought of her mother, alone in that hospital bed, and prayed someone would tell her what had happened. She thought of her father, the man she'd never known, and wondered if this was how he'd felt in his final moments, afraid and alone and desperate for someone to save him. And she thought of Roel. His name rose up in her mind unbidden, and she couldn't push it away no matter how hard she tried. She saw his face, felt his hands, heard his voice saying her name like it was the only word he knew. She hated him. She loved him. She wanted him here, wanted him to find her, wanted— The van jerked to a stop. Hands grabbed her again, dragging her out into cold air that smelled like rust and motor oil. Her feet stumbled on concrete as they half carried, half dragged her forward, and then a door slammed behind her and the acoustics changed, echoey, vast, empty. The blindfold was ripped from her eyes. She blinked against the harsh fluorescent light, her vision swimming before it slowly focused on the space around her. A warehouse, abandoned from the look of it, rusted equipment, broken windows, pigeons cooing somewhere in the rafters, and standing in front of her, a man she'd never seen before. He was older than Roel, maybe mid-50s, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that held absolutely nothing. No warmth, no cruelty, no emotion at all. Just emptiness, vast and cold as the warehouse around them. Mrs. Rucci. His voice was soft, almost pleasant, and somehow that made it worse. I've been wanting to meet you for some time. Amelia's arms were wrenched behind her, and she felt herself being forced down into a chair, felt rope wind around her ankles and chest until she couldn't move. Her breath was coming too fast, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Who are you?" Her voice came out thin, trembling, nothing like the strength she wished she had. "What do you want?" The man smiled, a thin, cold thing that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Marco Colombo, and what I want is very simple." He pulled a phone from his pocket, his thumb moving across the screen. "I want your husband to watch you die the way I watched my brother die, 15 years ago, by his hand." Amelia's blood turned to ice in her veins. She watched him lift the phone to his ear, watched his lips curve into that terrible, empty smile, and felt the last shreds of hope drain out of her. "Rucci." Colombo's voice was almost cheerful. "I have something of yours. If you want her back, alive, I suggest you come and get her." He rattled off an address, then ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His eyes found Amelia's, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "He won't come." The words scraped out of her throat before she could stop them, thin and wavering. Things between us aren't. Colombo laughed, a soft, breathy sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, he'll come." He crouched down in front of her, close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath. "I've seen the way that man looks at you, Mrs. Rucci, like you're the only thing in the world worth living for." His smile widened, showing teeth. "He'll come, and then he'll die, and you'll watch, just like I did." He stood and walked away, leaving her alone with the guards and the pigeons and the cold, creeping certainty that she was going to die in this place. And the only thing she could think, the only name that echoed through her mind as the minutes crawled by, was Rowell. The warehouse doors exploded inward. Amelia's head snapped up at the sound, her heart lurching into her throat as gunfire erupted somewhere in the darkness. Shouts, footsteps, the wet thud of bodies hitting concrete. She couldn't see what was happening, couldn't do anything but sit there and strain against the ropes that held her. "Amelia!" His voice cut through the chaos like a blade, raw and desperate, and something in her chest cracked wide open at the sound. "Roll! I'm here!" More gunfire, closer now. She saw shadows moving in the dim light, saw muzzle flashes and heard men screaming, and then suddenly he was there, rounding the corner with a gun in his hand and blood on his face and eyes that found hers across the warehouse floor. For one endless moment, everything stopped. He looked terrible. Unshaved, hollow-eyed, his clothes rumpled like he'd been sleeping in them for days. But he was here. He'd come for her. Despite everything she'd said, everything she'd done, he'd come. "Roll!" The warning died in her throat as a shadow moved behind him. Colombo stepped out of the darkness with a gun pressed to the back of Rowell's skull, and Amelia felt her heart stop beating entirely. "Drop it!" Rowell's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't lower his weapon, didn't take his eyes off Amelia's face. "Let her go." His voice was steady, controlled, but she could see the fear underneath it. Fear not for himself, but for her. "This is between us, Colombo. She has nothing to do with it." Colombo laughed, and the sound echoed off the warehouse walls like something from a nightmare. "She has everything to do with it." He moved around until he was standing beside Amelia, the gun now pressed to her temple. The metal was cold against her skin, and she couldn't stop the whimper that escaped her throat. "You took my brother from me, Rucci. Now I'm going to take something from you." Rowell's face went white. She watched his eyes flick from Colombo's face to hers, watched something shatter behind them, watched him make a decision that stopped her heart. He lowered his gun. "Rowell, no. Take me instead." His voice was calm, steady, even as he set the weapon on the concrete floor and raised his hands. "Let her go, and you can do whatever you want to me. I won't fight. I won't resist. Just let her walk out of here." Colombo's smile widened, and Amelia felt the gun press harder against her temple. How touching. He pulled the weapon away from her head, and for one brief, shining moment she thought it might be over. "But I think I'd rather she watch." The gun swung toward Rowell. Everything happened at once. Rowell lunged forward, his body moving between Amelia and the gun. The shot cracked through the warehouse like thunder, and she saw him jerk, saw the bloom of red spreading across his chest, saw his knees buckle as he crumpled to the concrete floor. She screamed. Another shot, from somewhere behind her, and Colombo's head snapped back, a dark hole appearing between his eyes. He fell, but Amelia wasn't watching him. She was fighting against the ropes, sobbing, screaming Rowell's name over and over as blood pooled beneath his body. "Roll! Roll, no, please!" Hands were cutting her free. Besnik, she realized dimly, his face grim as he sliced through the ropes. And then she was falling to her knees beside Roel, her hands pressing against his chest, trying to stop the bleeding that wouldn't stop. "Amelia!" His voice was weak, thready, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. "Don't talk!" She was crying so hard she could barely see, her hands slick with his blood, her whole body shaking. "Don't you dare! Just hold on, okay? Just hold on!" His hand found hers, his fingers cold and trembling as they wrapped around her wrist. "I'm sorry." The words came out as barely a whisper, each one costing him visible effort. "I'm sorry I should have. Stop!" She pressed harder against the wound, felt the blood seeping through her fingers no matter what she did. "Stop talking and just breathe. Please, Roel, please." His eyes fluttered closed, and for one terrible moment she thought she'd lost him. "Boss!" Besnik was there, pressing something against Roel's chest, a jacket maybe, something to staunch the bleeding. "The ambulance is on its way. 2 minutes." 2 minutes. An eternity. Amelia bent over Roel's body, her forehead pressed to his, her tears falling onto his face. She could feel his breath against her lips, shallow and weak, but there, still there, and she held on to that with everything she had. "Don't leave me." The words came out broken, barely audible. I know I left, but please, Roel, please don't leave me." His fingers tightened around her wrist, just barely, and she felt something that might have been hope crack through, the terror in her chest. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, and Amelia held on. The hospital waiting room was too bright, too clean, too full of people who didn't know that the world had ended. Amelia sat in a plastic chair with her hands clasped between her knees, Roel's blood still drying on her clothes, her skin, her hair. Someone had offered her scrubs to change into, but she couldn't make herself move. Couldn't do anything except sit there and stare at the double doors that led to the surgical wing. 3 hours. He'd been in surgery for 3 hours, and no one would tell her anything. Besnik sat beside her, solid and silent, his presence the only thing keeping her from flying apart. He hadn't spoken since they'd arrived, hadn't offered false comfort or empty reassurances, and she was grateful for that. She didn't think she could bear kindness right now. Kindness would break her. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity. She replayed the scene in the warehouse over and over in her mind, the sound of the gunshot, the way Roel's body had jerked, the blood spreading across his shirt like something alive. He'd stepped in front of that bullet, for her, had dropped his weapon and let a man shoot him so she could live. Her mother was 2 floors up in this same hospital, fighting her own battle. And now, Roel was somewhere behind those doors, fighting his. And Amelia sat in the middle, torn between 2 people she loved, unable to help either of them. She pressed her fist against her mouth, choking back a sob that wanted to tear its way out of her throat. She didn't know what this meant, didn't know how to reconcile the man who'd watched her father die with the man who'd just taken a bullet for her. Didn't know if she could ever forgive him, ever trust him, ever look at him without seeing the ghost of Nick Marcoux standing between them. But she knew she didn't want him to die. Mrs. Rusey! Her head snapped up at the sound of her name. A doctor stood in front of her, still wearing his surgical scrubs, his face tired but calm. "Is he—" The word wouldn't come. She couldn't make herself ask. "He's out of surgery." The doctor's voice was gentle, professional, but she could see something like relief in his eyes. "The bullet missed his heart by less than an inch. He lost a lot of blood, and the next 24 hours will be critical. But he's stable. Stable. Alive. Breathing." Amelia's legs gave out, and she would have hit the floor if Besnik hadn't caught her. She heard herself laughing, or maybe crying. She couldn't tell anymore, and she pressed her hands over her face and let the relief wash over her in waves. "Can I see him?" "He's still unconscious, but yes, you can sit with him." She was on her feet before the doctor finished speaking, following him down the corridor on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of machines, and the figure in the bed looked nothing like the man who'd terrified her, protected her, broken her heart. He looked fragile, mortal, human. Amelia sank into the chair beside his bed and reached for his hand, her fingers wrapping around his cold ones. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and she watched the rise and fall of his chest, counting each breath like a prayer. She didn't know how long she sat there. Hours, maybe. The sky outside the window darkened and lightened again, and still she didn't move. Couldn't move. Couldn't bear to let go of his hand even for a moment. And finally, just as the first rays of dawn were creeping through the blinds, his eyes fluttered open. Amelia. Her name in his mouth, weak, rough, barely audible, was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "I'm here." She squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his pale features. His fingers twitched in her grip, and she held on tighter. "You came back." A sound escaped her throat, half laugh, half sob, and she lifted his hand to her lips, pressing a kiss against his bruised knuckles. "You took a bullet for me, you idiot." Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. "Of course I came back." His eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion pulling him back under, but his fingers tightened around hers with a strength that surprised her. He was holding on, and so was she. 4 days after the bullet that should have killed him, Roll finally found the strength to say what he should have said from the beginning. Amelia sat in the chair beside his hospital bed, where she'd barely moved since he came out of surgery, her hand wrapped around his like she was afraid he'd slip away if she let go. The bruise on her cheek had faded to yellow, the rope burns on her wrists hidden beneath long sleeves, but the shadows under her eyes told him she hadn't been sleeping any better than he had. She'd stayed. Despite everything he'd done, everything he'd hidden, everything he'd cost her, she'd stayed. He didn't deserve it, didn't deserve her. But he was done lying, done hiding, done being the coward who couldn't face the truth. "I need to tell you everything." His voice came out rough, scraped raw from disuse and the tube they'd put down his throat during surgery. Amelia's fingers tightened around his, her green eyes, Nick's eyes, searching his face. "I'm listening." 2 words, and he felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure running through the wall he'd built around 18 years of grief and guilt. He took a breath that hurt, felt it catch against the bandages wrapped around his chest, and let himself fall back to where it all began. "Nick saved my life when I was 14. The words fell into the silence between them, and he saw her go still, not with fear, but with the focused attention of someone who understood that what came next would change everything. "The Colombos had taken me. Ransom. They wanted money, territory, a piece of my father's empire. They kept me in a basement for 3 days. He paused, the memories rising like bile in his throat, the darkness, the cold concrete floor, the sound of rats scratching in the walls, and the taste of blood in his mouth from where they'd hit him. I was just a kid, terrified. I thought I was going to die in that basement, and I thought... His voice cracked, and he had to stop, had to breathe through the tightness in his chest. I thought no one was coming for me.
My father had other sons, legitimate heirs. I was just the bastard he'd been forced to acknowledge. Amelia's breath caught, her free hand coming up to press against her mouth. He could see her processing it. This glimpse into the boy he'd been before the world had turned him into a weapon. Nick came alone. No backup, no plan. Just a gun and a promise he'd made to my father years before. He got shot twice getting me out. His eyes found the ceiling, tracing patterns in the white tiles, while the memories played behind his eyes. The smell of blood, the sound of gunfire, the weight of Nick's arm around his shoulders as they stumbled through the darkness toward safety. He carried me for half a mile, bleeding, barely conscious, but he wouldn't put me down, wouldn't leave me behind. His hand found hers again, gripping tight. He was more of a father to me than my own ever was. His voice cracked on the words, and he felt Amelia's hand tighten around his. She didn't speak, just waited, giving him the space to find his way through the story he'd been carrying alone for 18 years. That night, everything changed. He closed his eyes, letting himself fall back into the memory he'd spent so long trying to escape. Someone fed my father information. Said Nick was a traitor, that he'd been selling our secrets to the Colombos. It was a lie. We found out later that the real traitor was someone else entirely, but my father believed it. Amelia's grip tightened on his hand, her brow furrowing with a question he could see forming. Who? Her voice came out rough, scraped. Who was the real traitor? Roel's jaw clenched, old rage flickering behind his eyes before exhaustion drowned it out. A man named Victor Dressage, one of my father's most trusted lieutenants. He let out a breath that seemed to empty him. He'd been feeding information to the Colombos for years, framed Nick to cover his own tracks. Amelia was quiet for a moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand, and he could see her working through the implications of what he'd just told her. What happened to him? My father found out 5 years later, after Nick was already dead, after your mother had disappeared, after... His voice cracked. After it was too late to matter. Amelia watched his face, saw the weight of it crushing him from the inside. Her fingers tightened around his, anchoring him to the present when the past threatened to pull him under. He's dead, isn't he, Victor? My father made it last 3 days. The words came out flat, hollow. It didn't bring Nick back. Didn't undo what we'd done to an innocent man. Didn't help me find you or your mother. He turned his head away, unable to meet her eyes. That's when I knew for certain. Nick died for nothing. Died because my father was too proud to question the word of a snake, too eager to make an example, too... His voice broke completely. Amelia reached up and turned his face back toward hers, her palm warm against his cheek, forcing him to look at her. You were 21. You didn't know. I should have known. Should have fought harder. Should have... You couldn't have saved him, Roel. Not against your own father. Not against all those men. You would have died too. And then who would have looked for us? Who would have spent 18 years trying to keep a promise? His hands were shaking. He could feel the tremors running through him, could see Amelia watching them with an expression that looked like grief. They brought Nick to the warehouse. My father put a gun in my hand. Amelia made a sound, small, wounded, and he forced himself to keep going. He said, "Pull the trigger. Prove your loyalty." Like killing the man who saved my life was some kind of test, like everything Nick had done for me, for our family, meant nothing. The tears came without warning, spilling down his cheeks in hot tracks that he didn't try to hide. I couldn't do it. I stood there with the gun in my hand, and I couldn't pull the trigger. I wanted to, not to kill him,
but to end it quickly, to spare him whatever they would do if I refused. He opened his eyes and found Amelia crying too, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the worst moment of his life. Someone else did it, one of my father's men, and I watched him fall. His voice shattered on the words, breaking into pieces he didn't know how to put back together. His last words. He had to stop, had to breathe, had to force the syllables past the grief that was choking him. He looked at me, not at the man who shot him, not at my father, at me, and he said. Amelia leaned closer, her hand finding his face, her thumb brushing away tears he couldn't seem to stop. Protect my little girl. Promise me, Roel. A sob tore from Amelia's throat, and she pressed her forehead to their joined hands. He gave her a moment, gave them both a moment before he continued. I promised him, and then I lost you both. Your mother disappeared that same night, took you and vanished like smoke. He turned his head to look at her, needing to see her face, needing her to understand. 18 years. I searched for 18 years. Every lead, every rumor, every whisper that might have been about a woman and a little girl who used to be named Marku. His free hand came up to touch her hair, her cheek, the line of her jaw. Nothing. It was like you'd never existed. Amelia raised her head, her eyes red and swollen, her face wet with tears. But beneath the grief, he saw something else forming. Questions she needed to ask, truths she needed to hear. When did you know? Her voice came out raw, scraped. That first night? When you looked at me in the study? His jaw tightened, shame flooding through him. The wedding. The moment I saw your eyes under that veil. He watched her process it. The timeline, the implications, the weight of what he was admitting. And you married me anyway. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, and he deserved every ounce of the pain behind it. Yes, you touched me, made love to me, let me fall in love with you. Her voice cracked on the words, but she didn't look away, all while knowing who I was. What your family did to mine. Yes. The words sat between them like a blade, and he forced himself not to flinch from it. I told myself I was protecting you, that if you knew the truth, you'd run, and I wouldn't be able to keep you safe, that the secret was for your own good. Amelia's eyes hardened, and he saw the flash of anger beneath the grief. But that's not why you kept it from me. Not really. He wanted to look away, wanted to hide from the truth she was dragging into the light. But he'd promised himself no more lies, no more hiding, no more cowardice. No. The word came out barely a whisper. I kept it from you because I was selfish, because I'd finally found you after 18 years, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you again. Because somewhere along the way, keeping Nick's promise stopped being enough. I wanted you for myself. He forced himself to meet her eyes, to let her see all of it, the guilt, the shame, the desperate love that had driven him to make choices he knew were wrong. I was a coward. I chose my own happiness over your right to know the truth about your father, your family, your whole life. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, if you'll let me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that still remained unspoken. Amelia's hand was still in his, but he could feel the tension in her fingers, the war playing out behind her eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you. The words hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself not to react. He'd earned this, earned every bit of the pain she was feeling, the anger she had every right to hold on to. I know. I don't know if I can ever look at you without seeing. Her voice broke, and she had to stop, pressing her free hand against her mouth to hold back the sob that wanted to escape. Without seeing my father's face, without thinking about what he must have felt in those last moments,
His heart shattered, but he didn't look away. This was what he owed her, the truth, the pain, the full weight of what he'd done. "I understand." She pulled her hand from his slowly, and he felt the absence like a physical wound. His fingers curled into the empty space where hers had been, and he had to fight the urge to reach for her again. "I'm not leaving." Her voice was barely a whisper, and he could see the tears still streaming down her face. "You almost died for me. I can't. I won't walk away from that." A flicker of something, hope, maybe, or something too fragile to name, stirred in his chest, but her next words extinguished it before it could grow. "But I'm not ready to forgive you. I don't know if I ever will be." He nodded, accepting it. This was more than he deserved, more than he had any right to expect. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here. However long it takes, whatever you decide, I'll be here." She stood, and he saw her hesitate, saw the war playing out behind her eyes, the grief and the anger and the love all tangled together into something neither of them knew how to name. Then she leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead, brief and chaste, her lips cool against his fevered skin. "Get some rest." And she walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the beeping of the machines and the weight of 18 years of secrets finally spoken aloud. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Roll's life. Amelia stayed. She'd promised she would, and she kept that promise. But there was a distance between them now that hadn't existed before. She slept in the guest room, took her meals alone, spent hours sitting with her mother at the hospital while Roll recovered in the mansion that had never felt emptier. She was polite, cordial even. She asked about his recovery, reminded him to take his medication, made sure the staff brought him everything he needed. But she didn't touch him, didn't look at him the way she used to, didn't let him see behind the wall she'd built to protect herself from the wreckage of everything they'd been. He didn't push, didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. He just waited, patient as stone, and tried to become the man she needed him to be. Thomas Chapman was found 3 weeks after the warehouse, hiding in a motel outside the city. Roll's men brought him in, but it was Amelia who decided his fate, a one-way ticket to somewhere far away, with enough money to start over and a very clear understanding of what would happen if he ever came back. Darden was dealt with more harshly. Exiled, stripped of everything, sent back to Albania, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that his nephew had finally become a man he couldn't control. The first crack in the wall came 6 weeks after the hospital. Amelia found him in the garden, sitting on the bench where they'd shared their first real conversation, staring at nothing. She didn't say anything, just sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They stayed like that for an hour, watching the sun set over the Chicago skyline, neither of them speaking. But when she finally stood to go inside, her hand brushed against his, just for a moment, just the barest whisper of contact, and she didn't pull away. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. The second crack came 2 weeks later, when Roll woke from a nightmare to find her standing in the doorway of his bedroom. She'd heard him screaming. Nick's name, as always, the sound that had haunted his sleep for 18 years, and she'd come to check on him. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough with sleep and grief. "Go back to bed." But she didn't leave. Instead, she crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Tell me about him," she said softly. "Tell me about my father." And he did. He told her everything, the good memories, not just the bad. The way Nick laughed, loud and full, like he was trying to fill the whole room with joy. The way he taught Roll to play chess, patient even when Roll lost his temper at losing. The way he'd held his daughter, her, Amelia, a baby with her mother's smile and her father's eyes, like she was the most precious thing in the world. They talked until dawn, and when the first light crept through the curtains, Amelia was curled up beside him, her head on his shoulder, her breathing slow and even. She was asleep, and she was here. It still wasn't forgiveness, but it was closer. 3 months after the warehouse, Amelia asked Roel to take her to her father's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon light, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet as they made their way between the headstones. Roel walked beside her but slightly behind, giving her space, letting her set the pace. The grave was in the older section, beneath a maple tree that had probably been planted around the same time Nick was buried. The headstone was simple, white marble, weathered by 18 Chicago winters, but someone had kept it clean. Someone had left fresh flowers, replaced recently enough that they hadn't yet begun to wilt. Amelia looked at Roel, and he answered the question she couldn't ask. Every month, since the day we buried him. Her throat tightened, and she had to look away, had to focus on the letters carved into the stone. Nicholas Marcoux, beloved husband and father, 1965 to 2007. 42 years. Her father had only lived 42 years, and she'd been robbed of the chance to know him for even one of them. Roel released her hand and stepped forward, lowering himself to one knee before the grave, his head bowed, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Nick. He pressed his palm flat against the cold marble. I found her. After all these years, I found her. Amelia watched him through a blur of tears. This man who'd been her father's brother in everything but blood. I know I failed you. His voice cracked, and she saw his shoulders shake with the effort of holding himself together. I know I should have stopped it, should have done something, should have been stronger, but I kept my promise. I protected her, and I'll keep protecting her until my last breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a coin, old and worn, with markings Amelia didn't recognize. Besa. The word came out like a prayer. I give you my Besa, Nick, on my life, on my honor, on everything I am and everything I will ever be. I will protect her, I will love her, and I will raise our children to know your name. He pressed the coin to his lips, then set it at the base of the headstone. Amelia sank down beside him, her knees hitting the cold ground, her hand finding his. She leaned forward and pressed her palm against the marble, against the name of the father she'd never known. Hi, Daddy. The words came out broken, a child's greeting from a woman grown. I'm sorry it took so long. She didn't know what else to say. Didn't know how to compress 21 years of absence into a single moment. So she just knelt there, her hand on his grave, her other hand in Roel's, and let the tears fall. Mom talks about you sometimes, she finally whispered. She says you had the best laugh, that you could make anyone smile, even on their worst days, that you loved me more than anything in the world. Her voice broke, and she had to stop, had to breathe through the grief that was threatening to swallow her whole. I wish I could remember you. I wish I could remember your voice, your face, the way it felt when you held me. But I can't. All I have are pictures and stories and... She glanced at Roel, at the man kneeling beside her with tears streaming down his face. And him, the man you trusted to keep me safe. She turned back to the grave, her fingers tracing the letters of her father's name. He did, Daddy. He kept his promise. And I think... She had to stop, had to swallow the sob that wanted to escape. I think maybe you sent him to me. I think maybe this was your way of making sure I'd never be alone. Roel's hand tightened around hers, and she felt him shaking, with grief, with relief, with emotions too big to name. "I forgive him," she whispered, so softly that only the dead could hear. "I don't know if I should. I don't know if it makes me weak or foolish or—" She shook her head. "But I love him, and I think you would have wanted me to love him. I think you would have wanted us to find each other." She pressed a kiss to her fingers, then touched them to the cold marble. "I'll come back. I'll come back and tell you everything. About my life, about Mom, about the family we're going to build." She looked at Roel, and for the first time in 3 months, she smiled. "Your grandchildren are going to know your name, Daddy. I promise." When they finally rose, the sun was setting behind the Chicago skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Roel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, letting him take some of her weight. "Thank you," she said softly, "for bringing me here, for taking care of him all these years." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "He was my family. You're my family. This is what family does." They walked back to the car together, and Amelia didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her father was at peace, and so, finally, impossibly, was she. 6 months later. Amelia woke to morning light streaming through the curtains, and the warmth of Roel's body curved around hers. His arm was draped across her waist, protective even in sleep, and she lay still for a moment, just breathing him in. It had taken time to get here. Weeks of distance, followed by weeks of tentative reconnection. The first time she'd let him hold her again, she'd cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of being in his arms. The first time they'd made love after everything, it had been slow and careful, both of them learning each other all over again. But they'd made it. Through the grief, through the anger, through the long, slow process of rebuilding trust from the ruins of secrets and lies. They'd made it. She slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake him, and padded to the bathroom. The test was still where she'd hidden it, tucked behind the extra towels where he wouldn't think to look. She'd bought it 3 days ago, when the nausea started, and her period didn't. Her hands were shaking as she unwrapped it. 5 minutes later, she sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at 2 pink lines that had just rewritten her entire future. Her hand found her stomach instinctively, pressing flat against the place where something impossible was already beginning. A life. A child. A piece of her and Roel tangled together into something new. "Amelia?" His voice came from the bedroom, rough with sleep and the edge of worry that never quite left him. "I'm here." She stood, her legs unsteady, and opened the bathroom door. He was sitting up in bed, the sheets pooled around his waist, the scars on his chest catching the morning light. 6 months, and the sight of them still made her heart clench, the permanent reminder of how close she'd come to losing him. "What's wrong?" He was already moving, swinging his legs out of bed, crossing to her in 3 quick strides. His hands found her face, her shoulders, checking for damage. "You're pale. Are you sick?" She caught his wrists and held them, steadying him, steadying herself. Nothing's wrong. She lifted the test so he could see it, watched his eyes drop to the 2 pink lines, watched the meaning of them register on his face. "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the silence between them like stones into still water. For a long moment, Roel didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there staring at the test in her hand with an expression she couldn't read. Then his legs gave out. He sank to his knees in front of her, his forehead pressing against her stomach, his hands shaking where they gripped her hips. "We're having a baby." She said it for him, her fingers threading through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Roel." He looked up at her with tears streaming down his face. This man who'd killed and bled and spent 18 years carrying a grief that nearly destroyed him, crying like a child at the news that he was going to be a father. "I don't know how to do this." His voice cracked, raw with fear. "I don't know how to be a father. Mine was—" "You're not him." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You are not your father. You never were. You're the man who kept a promise for 18 years. The man who bled for me, who almost died for me, who loved me even when he was terrified of what that love might cost." She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his. "You're going to be an amazing father, and I'm going to be right here, every step of the way. We'll figure it out together." He surged up and kissed her, desperate, grateful, overflowing with an emotion too big for words. When he pulled back, he was laughing and crying at the same time, his hands cradling her stomach like he was already trying to protect what was growing there. "I love you." He breathed the words against her lips. "I love you, and I'm going to love this baby, and I'm going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you both know it." She smiled, thinking of white veils and bloody sheets, and a man who'd looked at her like she was a ghost made flesh. Thinking of a promise whispered in a dying man's last breath, carried for 18 years across grief and guilt and hope. "Protect my little girl." He had. Against everything, against his own darkness, his family's sins, the secrets that had nearly destroyed them both. He had, and now they would protect this new life together. She'd thought he was her cage once. A prison made of silk sheets and dangerous eyes, and a wedding ring she'd never asked for. But standing here now, with his hands on her belly and his tears on her skin, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine, she understood at last. He wasn't her cage. He wasn't even her salvation. He was her home. And she was finally, impossibly, exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for staying with me through Amelia and Roel's journey. Now, I want to ask you something real. Could you love a man like Roel? And if you found out he'd been keeping a secret like this, would you stay or would you walk away? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, fear, hope, that ache in your chest when love gets complicated, hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like this only happen when you're here with me.